The Aztec death whistle is one of the most unusual and unsettling weapons known from the pre-Columbian Americas. It wasn't made to stab, slash, or burn. It was made to frighten. These whistles were typically crafted from clay and often shaped like skulls or animals. They featured a hollow internal structure with an air channel that, when blown through with force, produced an intense, high-pitched sound that closely mimicked a human scream. Researchers believe they were used by Aztec warriors during battle, particularly in the moments just before combat began. The purpose wasn't physical damage. It was psychological shock. Imagine hundreds of these whistles being blown in unison. The sound wouldn't resemble music or typical war horns. It would sound like panic, like a mass execution already in progress. This created confusion, fear, and hesitation in the enemy, all before a single blade was drawn. The Aztec Empire flourished in what is now central Mexico until its fall in the early 16th century during the Spanish conquest. It was a militarized society with an emphasis on ritual, symbolism, and spectacle. And the death whistle fits neatly into that cultural framework. Some archaeologists believe the whistles may have had additional uses in religious rituals, particularly involving death or sacrifice. For example, they may have been played during ceremonies for the god Mictlantecutli, the Aztec deity of death. Others suggest they were used in funerals, to represent the passage of the soul, or to mimic the cries of the dying during offerings to the gods. However, no written records from the Aztecs specifically describe their battlefield use. Much of what we believe today comes from archaeological findings and modern reconstructions of the sound. And the sound is not subtle. In audio tests, the reconstructed death whistle produces a chilling shriek. High frequency, sharp, and deeply unsettling to most human listeners. The whistle targets innate fear responses by mimicking distress. The Aztec death whistle is an early example of acoustic psychological warfare, the use of sound to manipulate enemy behavior or morale. Unlike modern sonic weapons that use infrasonic frequencies to disorient, this was a low-tech but highly effective method of spreading fear. And it worked, not because it caused pain, but because it caused the expectation of pain. In warfare, the mind breaks long before the body does. Greek fire was not just a weapon, it was a warning, a spectacle, a message that came in flames. It first appeared in the hands of the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century, a period marked by constant invasion, siege, and shifting power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Byzantines, inheritors of Rome, were surrounded by enemies and vastly outnumbered on many fronts. But what they lacked in numbers, they made up for with something no one else had: a liquid fire that water couldn't kill. Greek fire, also known as sea fire or liquid fire, was used primarily in naval warfare. Its most terrifying property, and what made it stand apart from anything else used in ancient battle, was its ability to burn on water. No one fully understood why. They still don't. It would cling to ships, to sails, to the surface of the ocean. It would spread, hissing, glowing, snapping at the wind, until entire fleets were in chaos. Byzantine ships were often fitted with devices called siphons, long bronze tubes mounted to the bow, connected to pressurized tanks. When enemy ships came into range, Greek fire would be expelled through these tubes in a stream, like an ancient flamethrower. The result was an arcing ribbon of flame that ignited on contact and left behind scorched wreckage and the sounds of panic. The first recorded use was in 672 AD, during the first Arab siege of Constantinople. Arab forces, superior in size, brought a massive fleet to the city's waters. They expected a siege, traditional warfare. What they met was something closer to nightmare. As Byzantine ships approached, the flames began to spray. Contemporary accounts describe the fire as unquenchable. The Arab fleet broke formation. Boats capsized from panic. Sailors jumped into the sea, only to find the water itself was burning. No amount of training could prepare you for that, and no amount of water could save you. But the real brilliance of Greek fire wasn't just its chemistry, it was its secrecy. The formula was a tightly held military secret, passed down from father to son, never written down, and likely known only to a handful of Byzantine engineers known as fire masters. There was no way to replicate it outside of the empire. No trade, no theft, no espionage ever broke that chain. Modern historians have speculated on what it may have included. Petroleum or crude oil, sulfur, quicklime, pine resin, and naphtha are all contenders. But none of the recreations tested today behave quite the way Greek fire was described. Some believe that quicklime, which reacts violently with water, may be the reason it burned on the sea. Others think the key was in the pressure delivery system, and that the fire itself was a multi-stage chemical reaction, igniting in air, spreading with fuel, and staying active even when submerged. But no one really knows, and that's what made it so powerful. If you were fighting the Byzantines, Greek fire wasn't just a threat, it was a mystery. You couldn't prepare for it. You couldn't understand it. All you could do was pray you weren't the target. And in that way, Greek fire became not just a weapon, but a psychological event. It was rare. It was dramatic. It signaled something worse than battle. It signaled fear. Just the presence of the siphons on a Byzantine ship could cause enemy fleets to hesitate, to scatter, to retreat, even if it wasn't used. Greek fire didn't need to be constant to be effective. It just needed to be remembered. Over time, Byzantine engineers developed handheld versions, clay grenades filled with the liquid that could be thrown over walls. They created smaller tube-based versions that could be used in land battles. In some cases, Greek fire was launched via catapults inside sealed pots. These would shatter on impact and ignite whatever they touched. There are reports of entire cities being lost to a single Greek fire barrage. But eventually, as the empire declined and innovation slowed, Greek fire was lost. The last major uses were recorded during the 12th century. By the 13th century, it was gone, not just as a tactic, but as a formula. The fire that once turned oceans to ash disappeared completely. Not a single surviving document ever revealed the exact ingredients. No archaeological find has uncovered a full working device. No modern reconstruction has matched the fire's behavior exactly. To this day, Greek fire is considered one of the lost technologies of history, the kind of invention that should have changed everything, but instead vanished. What remains is myth, terror, and the memory of something that could turn water into flame and ships into shadows. Greek fire was not made for destruction alone. It was made for effect, for fear, for the kind of silence that happens just before surrender. Because when your enemies see the sea catch fire, they don't just lose the battle, they lose the will to fight at all. Long before engines, before tanks, before steel and combustion and the roar of artillery, there were elephants, not in cages, not in zoos, but armored, decorated, trained for war. In the ancient world, war elephants were the closest thing to battlefield monsters. They weren't symbolic, they weren't ceremonial. They were used, and they were feared. From India to Carthage, from Alexander the Great to Hannibal's Alps crossing campaign, these animals were bred, weaponized, and unleashed as living engines of destruction. And nothing, not even fire, could stop them once they charged. War elephants have been documented as early as the 11th century BCE in the Indian subcontinent. By the time of the Mahabharata, an ancient Indian epic, elephants were already portrayed as core components of elite armies. They were considered sacred, strategic, and devastating. What made elephants so effective wasn't just their size, it was what they did to the human mind. Imagine standing in formation, shield in hand, orders in your ear. You're ready for battle. Then, over the rise, the ground begins to shake. You hear it before you see it. A thunderous rhythm, the breaking of trees, the metallic rattle of armor on muscle. And then they appear. Massive creatures, 8 to 12 feet tall. Tusks plated with bronze. Heads covered in ornate chainmail. On their backs, archers, javelin throwers, or full wooden howdahs. Miniature fortresses strapped to living titans. You don't see soldiers anymore. You see gods. You see death. And if they charge, there is no standing still. An elephant could weigh up to 6 tons. That's over 12,000 pounds of momentum. They were trained to crush infantry, to trample lines, to gore enemy cavalry, and swing soldiers aside like puppets. Their thick hides made them hard to wound. Arrows would bounce off. Spears might stick, but rarely stop them. And their endurance meant they could fight for hours, not just physically, but psychologically. Because every moment an enemy watched them draw closer was a moment of rising panic. Not just about dying, but about how they'd die. In battle, elephants served multiple roles. They broke enemy formations. They protected elite generals. They created chaos in ways no human unit could replicate. Commanders like Chandragupta Maurya, Porus, and later Pyrrhus of Epirus used war elephants to dominate entire campaigns. Even Alexander the Great, during his invasion of India, struggled to overcome them, facing an opponent who had mastered the psychological terrain as much as the physical. One of the most famous uses came centuries later, during the Second Punic War, when Hannibal led dozens of elephants over the Alps to attack the Roman Republic from the north. It was an act of near-impossible strategy, transporting massive beasts through snow-covered mountains. And while many of the animals didn't survive the crossing, the few that did were enough to terrify the Roman legions who had never seen anything like them. But elephants were not perfect weapons. They could panic. They could stampede in the wrong direction. They could be spooked by fire, loud noises, or the smell of blood. When they turned on their own armies, the results were catastrophic. And over time, as warfare evolved, militaries developed counters, spiked ditches, flaming projectiles, specialized spear units. Eventually, the effectiveness of war elephants declined. By the time of gunpowder warfare, their massive size became a liability, a target rather than an asset. The last recorded use of elephants in battle was in the 19th century, by some Southeast Asian kingdoms resisting colonial forces. Even then, they were more symbolic than strategic. And yet, the image never died. The elephant as a weapon, massive, majestic, terrifying, remains one of the most iconic ideas in the history of warfare. It wasn't just about killing. It was about showing the enemy that they weren't just fighting men. They were fighting the impossible. War elephants were never the most common weapon. They were expensive, hard to control, and unpredictable. But when they were used correctly, they changed the shape of the battlefield. They turned courage into hesitation, orders into chaos, lines into footprints. And if you were on the receiving end of the charge, you didn't just remember the loss. You remembered the sound, the weight, the fear. Because some weapons are made of iron, others are made of flesh. Before the sky darkened with arrows, there was a sound, not of footsteps, not of steel, but a rising, eerie whistle, thin, sharp, and unnatural. A note that cut through the air and through the nerves of every soldier who heard it. It wasn't the sound of death, not yet. It was the sound that came before it. This was the role of the whistling arrow, a weapon that struck the mind before it ever struck the body. The design was simple, a regular arrow tipped not just with metal but with a bulb, often made of bone, gourd, wood, or later bronze. That bulb was hollow, drilled with small, precise holes. As the arrow flew, air rushed through it, and the sound emerged. A high-pitched shriek, a scream, or in some designs, a whine that rose in pitch as it gained speed. It didn't matter if the arrow hit you. It already did something to you before that. The earliest recorded use of whistling arrows comes from ancient China around the 6th century BCE during the Warring States period. Generals would use them to signal different commands, to flank, to charge, to regroup. In a time before radios, flags, or gunpowder, sound was the fastest way to reach across the battlefield. But like many tools of war, this one evolved. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, whistling arrows had become more than just signal flares. They were used to test a warrior's composure, to mark elite archers in competitions, to scare off enemies in hunting forests, and, most importantly, to break enemy formations before they could ever strike back. Then came the Mongol Empire. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, psychological warfare became a science. The Mongols were master tacticians. They studied the reactions of their enemies. They watched for the smallest crack in morale. And they used every available tool to create hesitation, because hesitation meant death. Whistling arrows became a staple of the first wave of attack. Before the lethal barrage began, a coordinated volley of whistling arrows would fill the air, not aimed at bodies, but at the spaces around them. It created a sound wall, a sharp, unnatural cacophony that made soldiers duck, freeze, or look up at the wrong time. That pause, that flicker of doubt, was all the Mongols needed. The real arrows came a second later, and they almost never missed. But this weapon didn't need to kill to win, because fear spreads faster than blood, and once it enters the ranks, it's hard to root out. Soldiers on the receiving end would report confusion, panic, the feeling of being surrounded, even when the enemy hadn't yet arrived. Some would throw down weapons, others would run, some froze and never moved again. The arrow may not have pierced their flesh, but it pierced their control. The Mongols weren't the only ones. In Japan, the samurai used a variant known as the kabura-ya, a signal arrow with a distinctive howling sound. It was considered both a tactical and spiritual tool. Before battles, samurai would fire kabura-ya across enemy lines as a ritual warning. It was believed that the scream of the arrow summoned the attention of the gods, and that its presence would frighten malevolent spirits. In some texts, entire battles were said to begin with an exchange of whistling arrows, almost like a formal handshake, before the blades were drawn. Even in Korean and Central Asian warfare, whistling arrows appeared as both tactical instruments and ritual symbols. Their sounds were sometimes encoded, with different hole configurations corresponding to different commands. But the result was always the same: alert the army, intimidate the enemy, begin the end. The whistling arrow is proof that a weapon doesn't need to be fatal to be effective. It doesn't even need to touch you. It just needs to make you believe something worse is coming. And in that belief, you lose your edge. You overthink. You break formation. You listen when you should be moving. That's when the real arrow hits. Today, whistling arrows have faded into ceremony and sport. You can still hear them in traditional archery exhibitions across East Asia. The sound remains, but the fear is gone. Still, if you close your eyes and imagine that high, distant scream in a war-torn sky, you might feel what they felt. Not pain, not death. Just that moment when the air around you starts to scream. Flaming chariots. Long before engines shook the ground, long before artillery drowned battlefields in smoke, there were chariots, fast, light, deadly. They were the pride of ancient armies, elegant machines of speed and terror. But sometimes speed wasn't enough. Sometimes the chariot became something worse. Not just a platform for warriors, but a carrier of flame. The flaming chariot wasn't just a weapon of war, it was a weapon of fear. The basic idea was simple, yet devastating. Combine the unstoppable momentum of a charging chariot with the primal chaos of open fire. In ancient warfare, fire was feared even more than steel. A sword could kill a man, but fire could kill an entire city. Historical records suggest the use of flaming chariots, or at least fire-loaded carts, as early as the late Bronze Age, around 1500 BCE, and continuing sporadically through classical antiquity. They were deployed in regions like Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and possibly even Greece. The designs varied. Some chariots had bundles of burning pitch tied to their frames. Others carried pots filled with oil or resin, set alight moments before charging the enemy. In more desperate situations, unmanned chariots were loaded with flammable materials, ignited and released downhill, turning them into rolling firebombs. The target wasn't always enemy soldiers. It was enemy morale. Imagine standing in a tightly packed phalanx, spears up, shields locked, breath tight in your lungs. Then you hear the rumble. The ground shakes. You see movement, and then the glint of flame. Dozens of chariots, fire trailing from their wheels, their cargo ablaze, bearing down faster than a man can run. The instinct isn't to fight. The instinct is to run. And when a battle line breaks, even once, defeat often follows. In ancient India, epics like the Mahabharata describe warriors using fire-tipped weapons launched from chariots. Some of these accounts read almost like descriptions of mobile flamethrowers, blazing projectiles fired at massed ranks from fast-moving platforms. In Egyptian warfare, chariots were the elite vehicles of pharaohs and generals. There's speculation that during sieges, Egyptians may have employed flaming carts to disrupt enemy fortifications, although direct archaeological evidence is sparse. The principle remained the same across cultures. Use fire not just to destroy, but to disorient, to turn an organized army into a fleeing mob. Flaming chariots were high risk, high reward. Chariot warfare was already a dangerous art. Driving a lightweight two-wheeled cart at high speeds required immense skill. Adding flame made everything more unstable. A misstep could ignite your own ranks. A panicking horse could veer off course, dragging fire straight into friendly troops. A sudden wind could turn a brilliant tactic into a suicide run. Commanders who used flaming chariots accepted these risks, because if the gamble paid off, the psychological damage inflicted on the enemy could outweigh any losses. No soldier, no matter how brave, can easily stand firm when the earth beneath them is burning. Later, in ancient Greece, siege warfare saw variations of the flaming chariot idea. Accounts from battles such as the Peloponnesian War describe carts loaded with burning materials being sent downhill into enemy palisades. The goal wasn't to kill soldiers directly, it was to set fire to the defenses, to breach walls without swinging a single battering ram. Fires caused confusion. Confusion caused fear. Fear caused collapse. And collapse won wars. Flaming chariots were eventually made obsolete by changes in warfare. The rise of heavy cavalry, improved fortifications, and later, the introduction of gunpowder reduced the tactical advantage of fire-driven terror. Siege engines replaced mobile fire with more controlled destruction. And once armor became heavier and formations more disciplined, soldiers could resist the temptation to scatter. Still, echoes of the flaming chariot idea lingered. In medieval warfare, fire ships, unmanned vessels set alight and drifted into enemy harbors, mirrored the ancient concept: fire, moving under its own momentum. A mindless force you couldn't negotiate with or reason against. And in modern times, even psychological warfare tactics that rely on terror, misinformation, chaos, disruption, follow the same ancient logic. It's not enough to destroy the enemy's body. You must destroy their will. Flaming chariots weren't precision weapons. They weren't about body counts or tactical superiority. They were about fear. About the moment when even the bravest soldier sees a wall of fire coming at them and hesitates. That hesitation, that instant when the mind says no more, is where battles are won or lost. Because when fire rides on wheels, the battlefield itself becomes a living thing, and it doesn't care whose side you're on. Intimidation drums. Before the first arrow flew, before the first sword was drawn, there was sound, a deep, pulsing rhythm, louder than footsteps, louder than the heart hammering inside your chest. Not just one drum, hundreds, thousands, a rolling wave of noise that crashed across the battlefield long before the men did. This was the weapon of intimidation drums, and their purpose was simple: break your mind before the blade could break your body. The earliest known use of drums in warfare dates back thousands of years. From the jungles of Africa to the steppes of Asia, ancient armies understood something primal about sound. It didn't just travel faster than horses, it traveled deeper, into the bones, into the instincts, into the fear centers of the brain. Drums could coordinate movements, signal advances, warn allies from miles away. But when used deliberately for psychological warfare, drums became something else: a storm, a heartbeat too big to fight against. Imagine standing on an open plain. Morning mist clinging low, the distant hills empty at first. Then the sound begins, a low thud, a pulse, so soft you're not sure you heard it at all. Then another, and another. The rhythm building, growing faster, deeper, heavier. You grip your shield. You glance at the men around you. They hear it too. And somewhere deep in your mind, before the logical part can react, the older part, the animal part, begins to panic. Because the drums don't just tell you an army is coming, they tell you something unstoppable is coming. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan was legendary for their use of intimidation drums. As they approached enemy fortresses or fields, the Mongols unleashed a calculated sequence. First, soft drums, far away, measured, almost polite, then louder, more complex, more instruments added, cymbals, gongs, even battle horns. By the time the enemy could see the dust rising from the horizon, the ground itself seemed to vibrate. It made armies hesitate, made commanders doubt, made soldiers break formation before they even laid eyes on their enemy. And once formation breaks, battle is already lost. In ancient China, large war drums were mounted on wagons. Whole battalions would move behind walls of rhythmic thunder. Generals issued commands by changing drum patterns, but the added benefit was purely psychological. An army moving in perfect synchronization, backed by relentless mechanical pounding, didn't look human. It looked inevitable. And inevitability is the most terrifying enemy of all. African kingdoms also mastered drum warfare. In West Africa, intricate talking drums could transmit complex messages across miles of jungle. Before European forces even encountered enemy warriors, they often heard the drums, telling them, "You are not welcome here." The psychological effect on unfamiliar troops was devastating. Some early colonial accounts describe soldiers panicking at the sound alone, firing blindly into trees, wasting ammunition long before any physical engagement began. Fear spent their strength before the real fight even started. Even in medieval Europe, drums carried the power of fear. Though less emphasized than horns or banners, drummers marched at the head of regiments. Their job wasn't just to keep pace, it was to drown out the individual heartbeat and replace it with a single unified rhythm. In sieges, besieging armies would use drums at night, pounding slowly, relentlessly, hour after hour, denying defenders sleep, breaking their nerves, turning every dark moment into a countdown they couldn't escape. It wasn't about noise, it was about wearing the mind down. Why were drums so effective? Because sound is visceral. It doesn't need translation. It doesn't wait for permission. It slips past logic and hits the body directly, accelerating heart rate, elevating stress hormones, preparing the body for danger long before the conscious mind understands why. In modern terms, it triggers the amygdala, the fight or flight center. In ancient terms, it made you feel hunted. And in battle, feeling hunted is a fatal weakness. Intimidation drums didn't kill soldiers. They didn't wound horses. They didn't break walls. They broke confidence. They replaced human thought with animal fear. And once fear took hold, the real weapons could do their work without resistance. Because armies don't fall when bodies fall. They fall when courage does. Even today, echoes of intimidation drumming survive. Military marches, stadium anthems, riot control with sound cannons. The principle remains: if you can control the rhythm, you can control the fear. And if you can control fear, you don't just win battles. You win without needing to fight at all. Imagine a battlefield stretched wide under a gray sky. Tension so thick you can feel it in your teeth. Two armies facing each other across an open plain. The air holds its breath. Then, without warning, the ground begins to vanish. The soldiers across from you disappear, not because they retreated, but because the air itself swallowed them. This was the power of the ancient smokescreen, a weapon not meant to kill, but to confuse, disorient, and unmake visibility itself. In war, what you cannot see, you cannot fight. The use of smoke in warfare is older than gunpowder, older than cannons, older even than history in some cases. Evidence suggests that as early as 3000 BCE, civilizations in the ancient Middle East and China were using smoke for both offensive and defensive purposes. In its simplest form, it involved burning damp wood, leaves, tar, or oil-soaked fabrics to create dense, choking clouds. Sometimes it was used to cover a retreat, sometimes to conceal an approach, and sometimes simply to create chaos in the enemy's lines. Because confusion, when timed right, was deadlier than any blade. The ancient Egyptians understood this. During sieges, when invading fortified cities, they would sometimes set fires near gates and walls, not just to weaken structures, but to create a curtain of smoke. Under that cover, sappers could dig, battering rams could advance, and soldiers could scale walls unseen. The defenders, blinded by smoke, could only fire blindly, and blind fire rarely saves a city. The Chinese took smoke warfare further. As early as the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, Chinese military manuals describe the use of fog-making substances, mixtures of sulfur, saltpeter, and other chemicals burned to create thick, colored smoke. This wasn't just random haze, it was engineered atmosphere, clouds designed to shape the battlefield itself. Later, in the medieval period, these techniques evolved into sophisticated smoke bombs, primitive grenades filled with noxious fumes, used both to mask troop movements and to choke enemies. But even in their earliest form, smokescreens changed battles. They gave commanders the power to manipulate not just their armies, but the enemy's senses. Imagine the psychological effect. You're waiting for an enemy charge. You've braced yourself. You know your orders. And then suddenly, your vision vanishes. You can't see your comrades. You can't see your officers. You can barely see your own hands. Sounds grow sharper. Every whisper of movement becomes a threat. You don't know where the enemy is, or if they're already at your throat. Panic grows where discipline used to be. And by the time the real attack comes, if it comes at all, many soldiers are too broken to fight back properly. The Romans also used primitive smoke tactics. During sieges, they would burn sulfur-rich materials to force defenders out of tunnels and underground fortifications. Sometimes the goal was to smoke them into surrender. Other times, it was simply to blind and disorient long enough for siege engines to breach the walls. Smoke was cheap, it was easy to make, and it preyed on a universal weakness. Humans trust their eyes. Take that trust away, and even the strongest army can crumble. In India, accounts from ancient warfare describe the use of fire arrows aimed specifically at supply carts carrying oil or flammables. The resulting fires weren't just destructive, they created massive, uncontrolled clouds of smoke that could shift the balance of battle. Archers would shoot into the chaos, taking down enemies who couldn't see to defend themselves. In some cases, entire riverbanks or passes were choked with smoke, forcing enemy armies to abandon carefully planned formations and fight in the open, where they were most vulnerable. Smoke screens were weapons without edges, battles without direct confrontation, victories that came not through strength, but through disappearance. And that made them one of the earliest examples of information warfare. The battle for what the enemy thinks they know. Because when you can make an enemy doubt what they see, you can make them doubt everything else too. Even today, the core tactic survives. Modern armies deploy smoke grenades to cover movements. Tanks lay down smoke walls before advancing. Aircraft drop smoke flares to confuse incoming missiles. The principle hasn't changed. Visibility is power. Take it away, and even the strongest army becomes vulnerable. Smoke isn't just a barrier, it's an eraser. And in war, sometimes making yourself invisible is the deadliest move of all. Catapults firing diseased bodies. It begins with silence. A fortress under siege, an army waiting outside, no arrows, no charging cavalry, no flaming pitch, just quiet. Then, from beyond the walls, a sound. The heavy creak of a trebuchet arm swinging, the thud of something landing inside the city. Not a stone, not a firepot, something worse. A human corpse, bloated, broken, rotting with plague. And it won't be the last. Because some armies didn't just try to break walls, they tried to break bodies from within. This was an early form of biological warfare, the launching of diseased corpses over enemy defenses to spread panic, sickness, and death. Not through blades, but through infection. The idea was horrifyingly simple. When siege warfare dragged on for weeks or months, direct assaults became costly and difficult. Defenders could outlast attackers if they had strong walls, enough supplies, and discipline. So attackers changed tactics. If they couldn't batter the walls down, they would make it unbearable to live inside them. They would turn the city into a trap. The technique first appeared in ancient times. There are scattered references to similar tactics in Assyrian and Persian warfare. But one of the most infamous uses occurred during the 14th century, in the siege of Kaffa, a port city on the Crimean Peninsula. In 1346, Mongol forces besieging the city found themselves struck by an outbreak of plague, likely the Black Death itself. Rather than retreat, they weaponized it. Historical accounts, including those by Gabriele de Mussi, describe Mongols catapulting the bodies of their own dead soldiers into the city. The goal wasn't just psychological terror, it was biological collapse. The defenders were exposed to plague-infected corpses, fleas, and contaminated air. And it worked. The city fell into chaos. Some historians believe that fleeing survivors from Kaffa later carried the plague westward into Europe, unleashing one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. The weapon wasn't just the body. It was everything that came with it. The smell, the disease, the fear. Imagine living inside those walls. The first few bodies might cause shock. Soldiers would bury them quickly. Priests would pray over them. Medics would warn people to stay away. But then another comes, and another. Day after day, the corpses keep falling from the sky. The smell becomes unbearable. Water sources become contaminated. Food supplies are abandoned. The bodies don't just carry disease, they carry despair. And in siege warfare, despair is a faster killer than any sword. Sometimes it wasn't just human remains. Historical records suggest that in other sieges, animals were used the same way. Rotting carcasses of horses, cows, dogs, anything large enough to spread decay and fear. Launching dead animals into enemy fortifications served the same dual purpose: demoralize the defenders and destroy their ability to remain healthy long enough to resist. Disease didn't have sides. It didn't distinguish between soldier and civilian. And once it spread, no wall could hold it back. These tactics were crude by modern standards. There was no understanding of bacteria, viruses, or microscopic transmission. But ancient and medieval commanders didn't need microscopes. They had experience. They had memory. They knew that where the dead rotted, the living soon followed. And they weaponized that knowledge with brutal efficiency. The psychological effect was often even greater than the physical one. Even if sickness didn't immediately spread, the sight and smell of death alone could shatter morale. Troops might refuse to eat rations contaminated by falling debris. Civilians might riot, demanding surrender. Leaders might lose control long before the disease truly took hold. Because fear, once it infects the mind, spreads faster than any virus. By the late medieval period, the tactic of launching diseased bodies had become infamous. Though the practice declined with the rise of gunpowder and more sophisticated siege tactics, the basic concept of biological warfare endured, evolving over centuries into chemical and later microbial strategies. Today, it remains a chilling reminder that humans have always been willing to weaponize not just force, but nature itself. The dead don't march. They don't swing swords. They don't shout battle cries. But sometimes they win wars anyway. And the greatest terror they bring is not death itself. It's watching death fall from the sky and knowing there's nowhere left to run. When fire was a weapon for the mind picture. This, you're standing on a hillside. The air is thick with smoke. The crowd behind you murmurs, restless, electric. And in front of you, something enormous rises against the twilight sky. A giant figure made of woven branches, shaped like a man, towering, hollow, waiting. Inside it, prisoners, tied, trapped, silent. The wood at their feet is already smoldering, crackling, alive. This is not just execution, this is not just sacrifice, this is ritualistic burning. An act of war and domination, not just against the body, but against the soul. The Wicker Man wasn't built just to kill. It was built to terrify everyone who watched it burn. The concept of the Wicker Man comes from ancient Europe, particularly among the Celtic tribes of Britain and Gaul, regions that would later fall under Roman conquest. Our main historical source comes from Julius Caesar himself, in his accounts of the Gallic Wars. He described how Druids, the priestly class of the Celts, constructed massive human-shaped cages out of intertwined branches. Prisoners, criminals, and sometimes even captured enemies were placed inside, and then the entire structure was set ablaze. The burning was not just a punishment, it was a spectacle. The size, the shape, the slow, creeping flames. Every part of it was designed to turn execution into theater, a message written in fire and smoke across the sky. But it wasn't only about the deaths themselves. The Wicker Man served a larger purpose: psychological warfare. It told neighboring tribes, potential rebels, future enemies, this is what happens if you resist. It told captives, you are not just dying, you are being erased, body and spirit, in a fire that everyone will witness. It told the gods, if you believed in them, that the tribe was powerful enough to sacrifice lives on a massive scale. And even if you didn't believe, watching 100 men burn together would make you believe in something, even if it was just fear. Some historians debate how widespread the practice really was. Was Caesar exaggerating to paint the Celts as brutal savages and justify his own conquest? Maybe. But other Roman writers, including Strabo and Lucan, describe similar practices: ritual burnings, mass sacrifices, the use of fire as a way to cleanse, punish, and send messages. And even if the specifics varied, the principle remained the same across cultures. Fire was theater, and theater was power. Imagine being a soldier or a citizen seeing the Wicker Man rise. You know that the prisoners inside are alive. You hear them shouting, struggling, praying. You smell the smoke first, the green wood burning thick and slow. You see the flames crawl up the giant's legs. See the hollow body begin to glow from within. You watch faces pressed against the gaps in the branches. You hear screams that stop being human after a few minutes. And you realize this is not just execution. This is a ritual. This is the creation of a memory you will never erase. The effectiveness wasn't in how many died. It was in how many watched, how many remembered, how many carried the fear back to their villages, their homes, their dreams. Because once you've seen people burned alive inside a wooden giant, ordinary battle looks small. Ordinary punishments look weak. And the tribe that burned the Wicker Man looks invincible. In a way, the Wicker Man was an ancient form of propaganda, not made with words or scrolls, made with flame and silence. It turned the very act of death into a broadcast, one that said, "You can fight us, you can resist us, but if you do, your death will not be small. It will be seen, it will be remembered, and it will mean nothing except our strength." Today, the image of the Wicker Man lingers in modern culture, through stories, films, and myths. It's become a symbol of something deeper than brutality. It's a symbol of how terror isn't just inflicted with swords or arrows, but with ritual, repetition, and fire that burns not just bodies, but minds. Because sometimes the greatest weapon isn't what you destroy, it's what you force others to witness. And some fires never go out. Not because they keep burning wood, but because they keep burning inside the memory. When the mind broke before the walls did. Imagine a siege. The enemy outside is patient, disciplined, silent. You and your fellow defenders wait behind stone walls, starving, sweating, straining for every sound. And then it happens. You hear the distant, heavy thunk of a siege engine, followed by a whistling rush through the air. You brace for impact, expecting a stone, fire, destruction, but what lands is different. It's a head, human, fresh, mouth still open in a scream that ended too soon. And it won't be the last. Because sometimes the goal of war wasn't just to break walls, it was to break minds. And nothing shattered a man's courage faster than the sky raining the faces of his own comrades. The use of decapitated heads as catapult ammunition is one of the more horrifying realities of siege warfare. It wasn't about tactics. It wasn't about engineering brilliance. It was about psychology. About reminding defenders that their enemies had already started killing, and that they would not stop. It was a message sent not with words, but with blood and bone. Records of this practice span centuries, from ancient Persia to the brutal sieges of medieval Europe, to the endless frontier wars in Asia. Commanders who understood the fragility of morale knew how powerful a symbol a severed head could be. During the First Crusade, chroniclers wrote of Muslim forces launching the heads of Christian soldiers back over the walls of besieged cities, a grisly reminder of what waited outside. In turn, Crusader forces sometimes did the same, sending the heads of Muslim prisoners soaring back toward their fortified enemies. Death wasn't just an event anymore. It was turned into a spectacle. The process was brutal and deliberate. Captured prisoners, sometimes officers, sometimes common soldiers, were executed, often in sight of the fortress walls. Their heads, hastily severed, were then loaded into catapults or trebuchets. Sometimes they were launched singly, a single face soaring through the sky like a grotesque messenger. Sometimes they were hurled by the dozens, an avalanche of death crashing into courtyards, markets, wells. And wherever they landed, they brought more than just horror. They brought contamination. The smell of blood and rot, the spread of disease, the constant reminder that time was running out. Imagine waking up at dawn, walking to the well for water, and finding it fouled. Not by dirt, not by siege weapons, but by the severed head of a man you once shared a meal with. The psychological effect was devastating. It created fear, hopelessness, doubt in leadership. After all, if the enemy was strong enough to kill prisoners at will, strong enough to turn death into entertainment, how long could your walls really protect you? The tactic wasn't just about demoralization, it also had practical uses. Corpses and heads could spread disease, especially when launched into closed, unsanitary cities during long sieges. Historians describe entire outbreaks of plague, dysentery, and rot triggered by rotting biological ammunition hurled over walls. In a world without antibiotics, a single infected wound could turn fatal within days. Commanders who understood this weaponized nature itself, not with the precision of modern biological warfare, but with the cruel, blunt force of desperation. Some sieges became infamous when victory meant taking you alive. Picture a battlefield. Dust rising, swords clashing, shields buckling under the weight of desperate hands. In the middle of this chaos, a soldier steps forward, but he doesn't carry a sword. He doesn't aim to kill. He carries something different, a long, heavy pole. At the end, a metal ring split into cruel, sharp prongs, designed not to stab, but to trap. This was the man-catcher, a weapon built for a different kind of conquest. Not to end life, but to seize it. The man-catcher was a uniquely terrifying tool of medieval warfare and law enforcement. Unlike swords, spears, or maces, it wasn't designed for bloodshed. It was designed for control. Emerging in Europe during the late Middle Ages, especially between the 14th and 17th centuries, the man-catcher served a very specific, chilling purpose: to capture opponents alive, to drag them down, restrain them, and make them helpless. The basic design was deceptively simple. A pole, usually 6 to 8 feet long, tipped with a metal semicircle or ring. That ring split into 2 sharp, spring-loaded prongs, often fitted with barbs or spikes. The prongs were not meant to pierce flesh deeply. They were designed to clamp around the neck, arms, torso, or even legs. Once locked in, the more the victim struggled, the deeper the prongs bit in, holding them in a prison of iron and pain. Escape wasn't just difficult, it was almost impossible without help. The man-catcher had multiple uses. On the battlefield, it could be used to unseat armored knights, hooking them off their horses without the need for lethal blows. In cities and castles, guards used them to subdue dangerous prisoners, especially nobles or political enemies whose deaths might cause uprisings. And, in some darker cases, man-catchers were used during public executions, to control and display the condemned before the final sentence was carried out. Because nothing stripped away dignity quite like being dragged by the neck before a crowd. Imagine it. You're armored. You've trained for years. You expect battle to be brutal, bloody, decisive. But then you're caught, hooked, pulled down not by strength, but by leverage and brutal engineering. You struggle instinctively. The prongs dig deeper into your armor gaps, into the soft flesh beneath. Every movement tightens the grip. Every breath feels like a noose tightening. And you realize, this isn't a fight you can win. This is capture. This is defeat made visible. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical restraint. Being killed in battle could be seen as honorable. being captured like an animal, paraded, humiliated, displayed, was worse than death for many knights and warriors. It turned men into trophies, into bargaining chips, into proof of someone else's victory. And the man-catcher was the instrument that made it possible. The weapon saw particular use during civil conflicts, rebellions, and riots. Situations where authorities needed to control, not simply slaughter. For example, city guards during uprisings might use man-catchers to pin leaders alive for public punishment. Capture was often more valuable than execution. A living prisoner could be ransomed, interrogated, used as leverage. Dead men were silent, but captives could still be made to speak. Interestingly, the man-catcher wasn't just a European invention. Variations of similar capture tools appeared in Japan during the Edo period. The Japanese version, called the sasumata, featured a similar U-shaped head and was used by police to restrain criminals without lethal force. Though cultural designs varied, the purpose remained eerily consistent across continents. Control the body, break the will, capture the symbol of resistance. Over time, as firearms reshaped the nature of warfare, the man-catcher faded from battlefields. But it never disappeared entirely. Today, echoes of its design survive in modern riot control tools. Long-handled control poles used by police, restraining devices meant to trap without bloodshed. Because the principle remains powerful. You don't always need to kill to conquer. Sometimes you just need to take. The man-catcher is a weapon that speaks to a darker side of human conflict. The side where winning isn't about glory. It's about dominance, about taking the enemy's strength, their pride, and turning it against them. No bloody wound, no shattered armor, just a simple, terrible realization. You are no longer a fighter. You are a prize. And you will be shown to the world as proof that your resistance was never enough. When war turned into pure brutality. Imagine standing on a battlefield. You're armored, chainmail, maybe even steel plates. You trust in it. You've seen arrows glance off. You've felt swords scrape without drawing blood. Then you see the weapon. Not a blade, not a spear, a chain, a ball of iron, spikes glinting in the sun. And you realize armor won't help you here, because some weapons weren't made to be precise. They were made to smash, to crush, to shatter. And none embodied that brutality better than the flail and the morning star. The flail is one of the most fearsome and misunderstood weapons of the medieval battlefield. At its core, it's deceptively simple. A wooden handle linked by a short chain to a heavy spiked ball or club. Swing it, and the momentum of the chain allows the head to whip around shields, slam into helmets, smash through armor gaps. It didn't need finesse. It didn't need pinpoint accuracy. It needed only force, and that force, once unleashed, was almost unstoppable. The flail evolved out of agricultural tools. Farmers used flails to thresh grain, separating wheat from chaff by swinging weighted sticks. When war came to the countryside, that same simple idea, kinetic energy on a flexible joint, found new purpose. Soldiers learned quickly. A weapon that could knock grain from its stalk could just as easily knock life from a man. The morning star was its cousin, a spiked club or ball, often mounted directly on a shaft without a chain. Imagine a mace, but crueler. Each spike concentrated force into a tiny point, turning even a glancing blow into a puncture wound. Heavy enough to crush a skull, sharp enough to pierce chainmail, simple enough that even an exhausted soldier could wield it effectively. It didn't matter if you were clumsy. One hit was often enough. What made flails and morning stars so terrifying wasn't just the damage they caused. It was how unpredictable they were. A sword moves in clean arcs. A spear thrusts straight. But a flail? It could whip around shields, slide under helmets, curve unpredictably with momentum. Trying to block it was like trying to block the wind. And worse, the impact didn't stop at the surface. Even if the spikes didn't puncture, the force could cave in a breastplate, shatter ribs, leave a man crippled without breaking the skin. Imagine facing a knight armed with a flail. You raise your shield. You brace for the blow. And it doesn't strike where you expect. It snakes around the edge, cracking against your shoulder, snapping bones underneath your armor. You stumble. The second blow comes before you can react, and there's no stopping it now. Flails and morning stars were brutally efficient against armored opponents. Chainmail, so effective against slashes, offered little protection against the crushing force. Plate armor could deflect direct strikes, but not indefinitely. Repeated hits would dent, warp, and eventually break even the finest steel. And inside that steel, it wasn't the armor that broke first. It was the man wearing it. These weapons weren't without drawbacks. The flail, in particular, was difficult to master. The swinging head could be unpredictable, even for the wielder. Mistimed strikes could hit friends as easily as enemies. In close formations, flails risked entangling with other weapons and armor. But in one-on-one combat, or in chaotic melee, they were devastating. The morning star, being fixed, was easier to control, a favorite among foot soldiers and mounted knights alike for its sheer brutal reliability. Historical examples abound. In 14th century Europe, morning stars became a common sight on battlefields across France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Flails, while rarer in formal armies, appeared in uprisings and among mercenaries, where less disciplined but more vicious combat styles prevailed. Artwork from the period often depicts flails used in brutal, chaotic fights, where survival meant abandoning elegance in favor of raw, unstoppable violence. Today, the flail and morning star live on mostly in legend, symbols of medieval cruelty. But their design speaks to a deeper truth about warfare. Sometimes the goal isn't to outthink the enemy, or to outmaneuver them, or even to kill them cleanly. Sometimes the goal is simply to hit harder than anything the enemy can withstand. To break not just the body, but the will. Because when you see a weapon swinging toward you, and you know no shield will save you, fear does the rest. And fear, in battle, is often deadlier than any blade. When death was thrown over the walls, picture a medieval city under siege. The defenders are exhausted, food supplies dwindling, tensions rising behind the stone walls. They expect the usual: boulders, fire, battering rams. But instead, the sky brings something else: a heavy sack launched high by a trebuchet. It arcs through the air and bursts open on impact. Inside, rotting flesh, the carcass of a horse, or a cow, or dozens of rats knotted together, bloated, stinking. The ground is fouled. The wells are fouled. The very air turns against you. This was early biological warfare, the brutal tactic of using trebuchets to launch diseased animals over enemy walls. And it was as effective as it was horrifying. Trebuchets were the heavy artillery of the medieval world. Massive, counterweight-driven siege engines, capable of hurling heavy objects, stones, barrels, or worse, hundreds of meters with deadly precision. Their primary role was to break walls. But as siege warfare evolved, commanders learned something darker. You didn't have to break the wall if you could break the people inside. Launching diseased animals was one way to do it. The logic was cruelly simple. Rotting flesh carried disease. Contaminated water supplies attracted flies, rats, vermin, spread sickness among cramped, starving populations. And during a siege, where sanitation was already fragile, a few carefully placed carcasses could trigger an epidemic that killed faster than swords ever could. Historical examples are chilling. During the siege of Thun-l'Evêque in 1340, English forces catapulted dead animals into the French-held town to pollute the water and force a surrender. At the siege of Kaffa, the infamous 1346 Mongol assault, plague-infected bodies, both human and animal, were hurled into the city, helping spark what many believe was the first major outbreak of the Black Death in Europe. The tactic wasn't rare. It was widespread. Because once commanders understood that disease could finish a siege faster than battering rams, it became a standard part of brutal, efficient strategy. Imagine life inside a besieged city when the dead start falling from the sky. First, the smell. Thick, oily, sweet in the worst possible way. Then, the insects. Clouds of flies born in the carcasses, carrying disease from flesh to food to water. Then the sickness itself. Fevers, vomiting, open sores, panic spreading faster than any enemy army could have hoped. Not everyone would die immediately, but morale would break. The defenders, too sick or too terrified to fight, would turn inward, blame each other, abandon the walls they once vowed to protect, and when the gates finally opened, the city inside would already be a ruin. Trebuchets were particularly suited to this kind of warfare. Unlike smaller catapults, they could launch heavier payloads, not just single corpses, but entire bundles of death. Sometimes the animals were tied together, sewn into sacks, stuffed into barrels. The goal wasn't surgical precision, it was maximum contamination. Land a diseased carcass near a market square, a bakery, a main water well, and let nature do the rest. There was no Geneva Convention, no rules of engagement, no concern for collateral damage. Civilians were just as much a target as soldiers. Because the faster the city collapsed from within, the fewer lives the attackers risked storming the gates. Siege warfare was never about honor. It was about survival. And survival meant using every weapon available, even the dead. Launching diseased animals wasn't without risks. If the wind shifted, or if defenders managed to dispose of the carcasses quickly, the tactic could fail. There was also the danger of disease spreading to the besieging army itself, especially if camps were pitched too close to the walls. But for many commanders, it was a risk worth taking, a gamble measured in days, not bodies. Because if you could starve your enemy, sicken them, and break their spirit before they ever fired a shot, you won. The psychological effect was as deadly as the biological one. Seeing death hurled from the sky, watching friends waste away from unseen poisons, knowing that every meal, every sip of water might be your last. It wasn't just a physical siege, it was a siege of the mind. Today, the use of disease as a weapon is considered one of the darkest chapters in human warfare. Modern biological weapons are regulated, banned by treaties. But the core idea hasn't changed. Fear, contamination, despair. They are still among the most powerful weapons humanity has ever created. And centuries ago, they were carried not by missiles or chemicals or bombs, but by the silent, rotting bodies thrown through the sky by the swing of a trebuchet. When speed and blades became one, The dust rises. The sun blazes low in the sky. Two armies face each other across an open plain, waiting. And then, from behind the enemy lines, you hear it. Not just the thundering of hooves, but something else. A metallic shriek, the flash of steel, and you see them, chariots, hurtling forward at impossible speed. But they aren't just carts. They are weapons. Blades mounted on either side of the wheels, spinning, gleaming, slicing the air itself. These are scythed chariots, machines built not just to kill, but to tear armies apart. The scythed chariot represents one of the earliest attempts at mechanized terror on the battlefield. Simple in design, devastating in practice. They combined two of the most ancient fears, being trampled and being torn to pieces. The first recorded use of scythed chariots comes from the ancient Persian Empire, especially under Cyrus the Great and later Darius the First, around the 6th to 5th centuries BCE. But their most famous appearances came during the battles between Persia and Greece, where commanders unleashed these chariots against tightly packed phalanxes. A normal chariot could disrupt formations, but a scythed chariot didn't just disrupt, it destroyed. The design was brutal and effective. Standard two-wheeled chariots were fitted with long, curved blades attached horizontally to the axles. As the wheels spun, the blades spun with them, turning every revolution into a cutting stroke. Some designs added blades jutting out from the yoke in front, ready to slice through lines even before the horses made contact. The goal wasn't to fight individual soldiers. It was to shatter formations, to send terror rippling through the ranks long before the real fighting even began. Imagine standing shield to shield, shoulder to shoulder with your comrades. Then, out of the dust, you see a chariot racing straight at you. Not just fast, faster than you can react, and at knee level, waist level, spinning knives, slicing anything in their path. There's no time to dodge, no time to plan. The instinct isn't to fight, it's to flee. And when soldiers flee, armies fall. Scythed chariots were especially effective against massed infantry formations, tight clusters of spearmen or hoplites where mobility was limited. The sudden appearance of whirling blades could break cohesion, turn disciplined units into scattered individuals. And once the line broke, cavalry and foot soldiers could exploit the chaos. The scythed chariot wasn't just a weapon, it was a shockwave. A first strike aimed not at the body, but at the mind. But they weren't invincible. Skilled commanders learned how to counter them. During the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE, Alexander the Great faced Persian scythed chariots. Rather than panic, he trained his troops to open their ranks at the last moment, letting the chariots pass harmlessly through the gaps. Other armies dug trenches, laid traps, or used missile fire to kill the horses before the chariots could reach their lines. Against prepared forces, scythed chariots could be neutralized. But against unprepared or poorly trained troops, they were devastating. And even when they failed tactically, they often succeeded psychologically. The memory of spinning death, the sight of comrades torn apart, could linger long after the battle ended. Scythed chariots were a weapon of spectacle, and in war, sometimes the spectacle itself is the victory. Despite their fearsome reputation, scythed chariots gradually fell out of favor. As armor improved, as battlefield tactics evolved, their effectiveness declined. Infantry grew more flexible, cavalry more dominant, siege warfare more sophisticated, and in a world where battles moved from open plains to fortresses and cities, there was less room for machines of raw terror. Still, their legacy endured, not because they changed history, but because they showed how fear itself could be engineered, crafted from wood, metal, horses, and momentum. A perfect storm of motion and death. Today, the idea of scythed chariots feels almost mythical, an ancient nightmare made real. But in their time, they were more than legend. They were a simple, brutal reminder that speed is a weapon, that steel is a weapon, but fear is the sharpest blade of all. When the walls fought back, the castle walls loom above you. You're armored, sword in hand, marching with your brothers toward the gates. You expect resistance. Arrows, maybe. Rocks hurled from the parapets. But instead, you hear a different sound. A hiss, a roar, and then it happens. A black torrent spills from above. It hits with a wet, searing impact. And wherever it touches, skin burns, metal warps, screams fill the air. This was not a blade you could parry, not a wound you could bandage. This was boiling oil, one of the most feared weapons of siege defense. A weapon that turned stone walls into living things that fought back. Boiling oil was the nightmare of every siege engine operator, every ladder-climbing soldier, every desperate attacker hoping to breach a castle or fortress. It wasn't just about injury. It was about terror. About making even the approach to the walls a deadly, soul-shaking ordeal. Because in siege warfare, getting to the wall was supposed to be the easy part. Boiling oil changed that forever. The tactic was brutally simple. Defenders heated large vats of oil, or sometimes water, sand, or pitch, over roaring fires. Once attackers reached the base of the wall, the defenders would pour the boiling liquid down specially designed murder holes. Vertical shafts built into the gatehouses, towers, and parapets. The oil didn't just splash. It clung. It seeped into armor joints, under helmets, through chainmail. It turned every piece of protective gear into a trap, locking heat against the flesh. Burns weren't clean. They were deep, spreading, consuming, and no amount of armor could save you. Some historians debate whether pure oil was commonly used, due to its high cost. In many cases, boiling water, tar, or sand might have been more practical. But the psychological image of boiling oil stuck, because it was the symbol of inescapable pain. The idea that the very walls you attacked could pour death onto you from above. And in warfare, sometimes the fear of what might happen was more effective than the weapon itself. Imagine standing at the base of a stone wall, ladder in hand. You're ready to climb, to fight, to die if needed. But then you hear the hiss. See the glistening black slick pouring down. You see what it does to the man ahead of you. His armor steaming, his hands clawing at his helmet, his screams high and broken. And suddenly you wonder, is this wall worth dying for? Is any wall worth dying like that? Boiling oil wasn't limited to sieges either. Some defenders used it aboard ships during naval battles, pouring scalding liquids onto boarding parties to defend narrow gangways. Others used it during urban uprisings, tipping vats from windows onto enemy forces marching through narrow city streets. Anywhere that height gave an advantage, boiling oil became a weapon of terror. Because you didn't need skill to aim it. You didn't need courage to wield it. You just needed gravity. And gravity never missed. There was no good defense against boiling oil. Shields could block arrows, armor could stop swords. But boiling oil flowed around shields. It found the cracks in armor. It turned every protection into a weakness. Some siege troops tried to fashion covered rams, wooden frames with roofs soaked in water to resist burning. But these could be set ablaze with flaming arrows, or battered apart by falling stones. And even if you survived the oil, you were often left disfigured, crippled, haunted by burns that festered and killed slowly. Because medieval medicine offered no salvation for burns, only pain, infection, and often a slower death. The use of boiling oil was part of a larger reality, that siege warfare wasn't about clean battles between knights, it was about endurance, psychological collapse, turning the attackers into a terrified, demoralized mass before they even reached the walls. Boiling oil wasn't efficient. It wasn't clean. It wasn't glorious. It was effective. And in war, effectiveness was the only measure that mattered. Today, the image of boiling oil defenders is almost mythic, romanticized in movies and medieval lore. But behind the legend is something darker. A reminder that in ancient warfare, walls didn't just protect. They punished. They retaliated. They made attackers pay in screams and scars before they ever saw the other side. Because in siege warfare, the dead weren't the only casualties. Hope was a casualty too. And when oil rained from the sky, even the bravest learned what it meant to fear the very stones around them. Fire arrows with oil-soaked tips when the sky itself burned. You're standing in a fortress. The walls are strong, the gates are barred. You feel safe until you look up, until you hear it, a faint hiss, a rush of air, and then you see them. Dozens, hundreds, arrows, but not ordinary ones. Their tips burn with unnatural brightness. Small trails of smoke spiral behind them. They don't just fall, they ignite. The roofs catch first, then the siege towers, then the carts, the tents, the dry wooden beams. And suddenly, the fortress isn't a shield anymore. It's a trap. Because in ancient warfare, fire was the one enemy stone walls could not stop, and fire carried by arrows. It turned the sky itself into a weapon. Fire arrows with oil-soaked tips were a simple, brutal evolution in siege warfare. An ordinary arrow could wound, kill, terrify. But a fire arrow could destroy entire cities. It could turn stone walls into tombs, blockades into ovens, defenses into death traps. Because fire, once started, was hard to stop, especially in a world made of wood, cloth, straw, and oil. The principle was simple. An archer would wrap the tip of an arrow in cloth, soak it in flammable substances, oil, resin, pitch, and set it alight before firing. The oil helped the flame last longer. Resin made it cling to surfaces. Pitch made it harder to extinguish. The result was an arrow that didn't just puncture, it infected whatever it touched with flame. Fired in volleys, these arrows didn't aim at people. They aimed at structures, supplies, ships, anything that could burn. And once the fire started, the real destruction began. Historical records of fire arrows go back thousands of years. Ancient Chinese armies were among the first to use sophisticated fire arrow designs. By the Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, they had developed multi-stage fire arrows, some even with primitive gunpowder fuses. In the West, Greek, Roman, and medieval European forces used fire arrows extensively during sieges. Even the Mongols, masters of psychological warfare, used fire arrows during their relentless conquests, setting entire cities ablaze to force surrender before a single gate was breached. Imagine the scene. It's midnight. You're sleeping inside city walls. Suddenly, shouting, the thud of running feet, the glow of flames. You rush outside to find entire streets ablaze, fires leaping from rooftops, climbing ladders, eating the city from within. Not because the gates were broken, not because the walls were breached, Because the sky rained fire, and the fire didn't care who you were. It didn't care if you fought bravely or surrendered. It only cared about consuming. Defenders tried to adapt. They soaked roofs with water before sieges, covered critical buildings in wet hides, kept barrels of water and sand stationed on every wall. But fire, once started, moved faster than men. A single mist flame could devour an entire quarter of a city in an hour. And the panic it spread was often more dangerous than the flames themselves. Because when civilians panicked, soldiers were pulled away from their posts. When supplies burned, hunger followed. When the walls caught fire, escape became impossible, and the city fell from the inside out. Oil-soaked fire arrows were especially deadly when combined with other tactics. Siege engines, wooden towers, battering rams could be destroyed in minutes by fire arrows. Boats moored in harbors, supply carts on the roads, tents in army camps, all became kindling. And once an attacking army lost its supplies to fire, siege operations often crumbled. In some cases, desperate defenders launched fire arrows back at the besieging camps, setting enemy siege lines ablaze and buying precious time. Because in siege warfare, fire was one of the few weapons that cared little for walls or rank. It was the great equalizer, the invisible army that marched wherever the wind blew. The psychological power of fire arrows was enormous. Facing sword and spear required bravery. Facing fire required something deeper. It required the ability to watch your world burn and still fight back. Most couldn't, and many sieges ended not because the walls fell, but because the spirit of the defenders was consumed long before the stones were. Today, the fire arrow remains a symbol, a memory of how simple technology, cloth, oil, flame, could unleash destruction on a scale no sword could match. Because sometimes, the deadliest enemy isn't the soldier at your gate. It's the flame above your head, silent, relentless, hungry, and by the time you see it, it's already too late. Iron Maidens, the myth that became a symbol of fear. You stand before it, tall, dark, silent. At first, it looks almost human, a towering metal figure shaped like a woman, her face frozen in a cold, expressionless stare. The doors stand slightly ajar. Inside, rows of iron spikes, sharp, merciless, waiting. You know what it's for. You can imagine what happens when the doors slam shut. And in that imagining, you feel fear, real fear, even if the Iron Maiden itself never moves. Because the Iron Maiden wasn't just a device, it was a symbol, a myth made real by the power of terror alone. The Iron Maiden is often presented as one of the most brutal torture devices of the medieval world. A coffin lined with spikes, used to pierce and slowly kill anyone locked inside. But the truth is stranger and darker. Because the Iron Maiden, as we imagine it today, was likely never used during the Middle Ages at all. Its power didn't come from its reality. It came from its legend. The myth of the Iron Maiden first gained popularity in the 18th and 19th centuries, especially during a time when Europe looked back on the Middle Ages as a dark, barbaric era, full of torture, ignorance, and cruelty. Writers, showmen, and museum curators exaggerated stories of medieval punishment to thrill and horrify their audiences. The Iron Maiden became a centerpiece. It was designed to evoke maximum dread, an instrument that didn't kill immediately but slowly, as the victim bled out over hours, pierced but not slain. A device where every breath pushed flesh deeper onto sharpened spikes. A place where death came not from one blow, but from 100 tiny agonies. Historical evidence for real Iron Maidens is incredibly thin. Some early references to spike-lined coffins appear in ancient legends, stories from Greece, Rome, or even early Christian martyrdom. But no verified medieval Iron Maidens have ever been found. No authentic records describe their actual use. Most physical Iron Maidens on display today were built during the 18th or 19th centuries, assembled from old armor, wood, and iron scraps to satisfy a growing public fascination with macabre medieval relics. They were not devices of war. They were devices of imagination. One of the most famous Iron Maidens is the so-called Iron Maiden of Nuremberg, first exhibited in the 19th century. It captured the public's dark imagination instantly. Tourists flocked to see it. Writers described it in gory detail. Painters immortalized it. It didn't matter whether it had ever been used. What mattered was what it represented: the fear of inescapable pain, the terror of dying slowly, trapped, alone, the ultimate symbol of human cruelty, embodied not in action, but in possibility. Why was the Iron Maiden so effective as a myth? Because it bypassed logic. It didn't need eyewitnesses or proof. It spoke directly to the oldest, deepest fears humans carry: enclosure, helplessness, the slow inevitability of suffering. Just seeing it, even knowing it might be a fake, triggered the same primal horror. The mind filled in the blanks. Imagined the creaking doors closing, imagined the spikes biting into skin, imagined the silence that followed. The Iron Maiden didn't need to be real to be powerful. The idea alone was enough. Throughout history, the threat of torture has often been more powerful than torture itself. The rack, the wheel, the Iron Maiden, these became psychological weapons. Symbols that could make a prisoner confess before a single blow was struck. Symbols that could keep the populations obedient without a single execution. Because fear doesn't require blood. It requires belief. And once belief takes root, reality hardly matters. Today, we understand that the Iron Maiden was likely a fabrication, a twisted invention of later centuries, reflecting more about 18th and 19th century fascination with suffering than actual medieval practice. But the myth endures, because the Iron Maiden, real or not, taps into something that doesn't change. The fear that pain is waiting, silent, cold, inevitable, and that when it comes, no one will hear you scream. Naphtha throwers, ancient warfare's liquid fire. Imagine standing on a battlefield, the ground dry and cracked beneath your feet, the sun hot against your armor. Across the plain, you see movement. Soldiers carrying large jars, sloshing with something dark and viscous. You ready your shield, expecting arrows, javelins, swords. Instead, the air catches fire. Not just flames, but liquid fire, cascading, clinging, devouring everything it touches. Metal melts. Cloth ignites. Flesh burns without hope. You swing your shield up, but it doesn't matter. The fire sticks, and you realize you're not fighting men anymore. You're fighting something worse. The weapon you're facing is naphtha, an early form of petroleum, used in war long before modern flamethrowers. Naphtha throwers were among the most terrifying weapons of the ancient and medieval worlds. Not just because they killed, but because they turned battlefields into hellscapes. Naphtha is a flammable oil naturally occurring in some regions, especially the Middle East. The ancient Assyrians, Persians, Arabs, and Byzantines all knew of it, and they learned quickly. Ordinary fire could be beaten. Liquid fire could not. Unlike simple torches or flaming arrows, naphtha could spread across surfaces, seep into armor, set the ground itself ablaze. Once ignited, it clung to whatever it touched, burning hotter and longer than ordinary flame. And worst of all, it was almost impossible to extinguish with water. Early naphtha throwers operated in different ways. Some were simply jars, thrown or launched by catapults, shattering on impact and unleashing a wave of burning liquid. Others were more advanced. By the time of the Byzantine Empire, engineers had created handheld siphons, early flamethrowers that sprayed liquid fire directly at enemies during sieges. Using pumps and pressurized chambers, soldiers could blast jets of burning naphtha at attackers trying to scale walls. Imagine climbing a ladder toward the battlements, only to be engulfed in a stream of liquid flame. Armor becomes an oven. Wooden ladders turn to torches, and every breath feels like swallowing the sun. The psychological effect was devastating. Ordinary fire was feared, but it could be fought with water, sand, damp cloth. Naphtha could not. It spread faster than men could run. It turned defensive positions into death traps. It burned not just structures, but morale. Because once soldiers saw comrades reduced to burning, screaming figures, many broke and fled. And in siege warfare, breaking the defenders was often the real objective. Historical records are chilling. During the Arab-Byzantine conflicts of the 7th and 8th centuries, both sides used naphtha-based weapons. Byzantine sources describe siphon bearers defending Constantinople's walls, pouring liquid fire onto Muslim attackers during sieges. Arab armies, in turn, perfected their own forms, deploying burning oils not just in sieges, but on open battlefields. Later, during the Crusades, fire weapons became an arms race, with both Christian and Muslim forces escalating their use of incendiary devices. Each side understood: control the fire, control the fear. Handling naphtha was dangerous. Poorly sealed containers could ignite prematurely. Missed throws could set friendly troops alight. Specialized soldiers were trained in its use, and often treated with a mix of awe and terror by their comrades. Because one mistake could mean death for everyone nearby. And in the chaos of battle, mistakes were easy to make. Naphtha throwers weren't just used against soldiers. They targeted siege engines, wooden towers, battering rams, bridges. One well-placed jar could turn a siege weapon into a pyre, trapping enemy troops between fire and stone. And the smoke, thick, black, choking, further disoriented and broke enemy formations. Naphtha didn't just kill. It unmade armies. The parallels to modern warfare are clear. Today's flamethrowers, incendiary grenades, and napalm bombs owe their existence to the ancient terror of naphtha. The principle hasn't changed. Set the ground, the air, the enemy themselves on fire, and watch discipline, strategy, and courage melt away. Because fire doesn't need tactics. Fire just needs fear. Today, few physical artifacts of ancient naphtha throwers survive. Oil jars, scorched ruins, scattered records. But their legacy remains, as a reminder that the deadliest weapons aren't always the ones with the sharpest blades. Sometimes they are the ones that you cannot see coming, cannot fight, and cannot escape. When death falls like liquid, spreads like thought, burns like betrayal, you don't fight back, you just run. And even if you survive, you never forget the day the air itself caught fire. Ghost Army inflatable tanks. Imagine you're a soldier in World War II. You've fought across muddy fields, through shattered villages. You know the enemy is close. You know their tanks are relentless. And now, you see them. A whole column of armor massing on the horizon, turrets gleaming, tracks rumbling the earth. dozens, maybe hundreds of tanks. You radio for reinforcements. Your hands shake. You prepare for battle. But the tanks don't move right. They sway in the breeze. They shimmer strangely in the sunlight. Because they're not tanks. They're inflatable rubber decoys, and the soldiers moving among them aren't frontline infantry. They're artists, designers, actors. This was the work of the Ghost Army, a secret weapon unlike anything the world had seen before. The Ghost Army was officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, a unique U.S. Army unit created during World War II to wage war not with bullets and bombs, but with illusions. Their mission was simple in concept, but enormously complex in execution. Deceive, distract, and demoralize the enemy. Make them believe a force was somewhere it wasn't. Make them hesitate. Make them retreat, all without ever firing a shot. The tools of the Ghost Army were unconventional. They used inflatable tanks, rubber airplanes, dummy artillery, and even fake radio broadcasts. From the air, or even from a distance, these props looked real enough to fool trained enemy scouts. Paired with fake troop movements, staged conversations, and carefully manipulated sound effects, the Ghost Army could create the illusion of entire divisions where none existed. One of their most famous operations, in 1944, helped convince German forces that the main Allied assault would come from one location, while the real attack landed elsewhere. The deception saved thousands of lives. The inflatable tanks themselves were masterpieces of wartime ingenuity. Made of rubberized fabric, they could be inflated in minutes and moved easily by a handful of men. Set up correctly, they looked solid, massive, threatening. They cast believable shadows. They reflected light like real armor. From a reconnaissance plane, they were indistinguishable from steel. Even on the ground, in low visibility, they were convincing enough to change battlefield decisions. Commanders, seeing enemy armor massing in a sector, might divert forces, retreat from positions, or call in artillery prematurely. And in warfare, misdirection is as deadly as bullets. But the Ghost Army didn't rely on visuals alone. They crafted sounds of battle. Massive recordings of tanks moving, artillery firing, trucks rumbling. Using enormous speakers mounted on jeeps, they could blast these sounds over miles of terrain. An empty field could be made to sound like an armored division mustering for attack. A fake camp could sound like a city of soldiers. The enemy didn't need to see the threat. They needed only to hear it. Psychological warfare was the Ghost Army's true weapon, because war isn't just fought with guns, it's fought in the mind. If you can make your enemy doubt their intelligence, if you can make them react to shadows and phantoms, you win without risking your own blood. You make them waste resources, split their forces, weaken themselves out of fear of something that isn't there. The soldiers of the Ghost Army weren't typical warriors. Many were artists, architects, set designers, engineers. Some would later become famous in civilian life: painters, fashion designers, advertising executives. In the fields of Europe, they became magicians of war. They sculpted battles from smoke and rubber. They drew enemy fire onto empty fields. They turned the tide of real battles with props and recordings. And they did it all while carrying one terrifying secret. If they were discovered, if the enemy realized they were unarmed illusionists, they would be slaughtered. No mercy would be given to men who fought with lies. The Ghost Army's success remained classified for decades after the war. Their work was hidden under layers of secrecy, their missions buried beneath the larger narratives of D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and the drive into Germany. But their legacy is immense. because they showed something critical, that in war, force isn't always the strongest weapon. Sometimes belief is. If your enemy believes you are stronger, more numerous, more prepared, they are already defeated, even if the tanks they see are nothing but air. Rat bombs, when even the dead were weapons. Imagine a cold morning in occupied Europe. A soldier stands guard at a German supply depot, a warehouse full of coal stacked high for the winter. Everything looks normal, until he sees it. A rat, dead, half rotting, lying near the fuel. Annoyed, he grabs a shovel to flick it aside, and in that simple movement, death erupts. Not from the rat itself, but from the explosive charge hidden inside its body. The blast rips through the warehouse. The coal ignites, and in minutes, the entire depot is an inferno. Not from bombs dropped from the sky, not from soldiers storming the gates, but from something much smaller, much simpler, much harder to predict. This was the weapon of the rat bomb, one of the most unsettling sabotage tools developed during World War II. The idea was born in the minds of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, a secret British organization tasked with conducting espionage, sabotage, and reconnaissance in occupied Europe. Their unofficial motto was simple: set Europe ablaze. And they meant it. The SOE specialized in creative, unexpected forms of warfare. Weapons that didn't look like weapons, attacks that struck from nowhere. The rat bomb fit perfectly. The weapon worked on a disturbingly simple principle. Take a dead rat, slit it open, remove the internal organs, replace them with a small, high-explosive charge, fitted with a pressure fuse. Sew the rat back together carefully, making sure it looked no different from an ordinary carcass. Then smuggle it close to strategic targets, especially coal depots, locomotives, and power stations. The idea was psychological and practical at once. Coal stokers, railway workers, or soldiers finding a dead rat would naturally use shovels or pokers to dispose of it, often tossing it into a furnace without a second thought. But when the rat exploded inside the furnace, the blast wouldn't just kill nearby workers. It would ignite the entire fuel supply, triggering massive secondary explosions. A single rat could destroy a critical piece of infrastructure without ever firing a bullet. The genius of the rat bomb wasn't just in its lethality. It was in its invisibility. A bomb disguised as garbage. A weapon the enemy wouldn't notice until it was far too late. And even if no explosion occurred, the fear that any dead rat could be a bomb forced occupying forces to waste hours inspecting, clearing, and second-guessing. Sabotage didn't have to succeed every time. It just had to sow fear and slow the enemy down. The SOE produced hundreds of rat bombs. They were packed into crates and prepared for smuggling into occupied territories via covert supply routes, resistance networks, and clandestine agents. The operation, however, faced an early setback. One of the first shipments of rat bombs was intercepted by the Germans. Realizing what they had discovered, the Nazi authorities launched a massive campaign of warnings and inspections. Coal yards, power plants, and military depots across Europe were ordered to check every suspicious object, to treat every dead rat as a potential explosive. In one sense, the physical impact of the rat bombs was limited. Few, if any, detonations were ever recorded. But the psychological impact, it was enormous. Imagine working in a freezing rail yard. You see a rat lying in the coal. You hesitate. You call your supervisor. He calls another officer. An entire operation stops for hours because of a dead rat. That's sabotage at its purest. Not through destruction, through paralysis, through the fear of what might happen, rather than what actually does. The rat bombs showed something vital about modern warfare. You don't need to kill an army to defeat it. You can bleed it slowly, steal its time, choke its movements, force it to fight shadows and exhaust itself chasing phantoms. And the smaller the weapon, the harder it is to fight. Today, rat bombs live mostly in obscure history, a footnote in the story of the SOE's long shadow over World War II. But they remain a chilling reminder that in desperate times no tool is too strange, no deception too small. And sometimes, the deadliest weapon on a battlefield isn't a tank, a plane, or a bomb. It's fear itself, smuggled into enemy lines inside the smallest, most unassuming corpse, waiting for the moment when a soldier lets his guard down, and the world explodes. Bat bombs, when war learned to fly in the dark. Imagine standing on a peaceful city street. The sun is just beginning to rise. Shadows stretch long across the rooftops. The morning is still, almost silent. Then you hear it, a faint fluttering, whispers of wings overhead, something moving, fast, unpredictable. At first, you think it's just bats, a swarm disturbed from their roost. But then the fires start. One building, then 2, then 20. Explosions, small but deadly, bloom across the city like sparks from a dying fire. And before you can react, the city is burning. Not from bombs dropped by planes, but from tiny creatures, each one carrying a weapon. This was the vision behind one of the strangest and most chilling experiments of World War II, the bat bomb. The idea for bat bombs was conceived in 1942 by an American dental surgeon named Lytle S. Adams. He proposed it directly to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was intrigued enough to set the project in motion. The plan was bizarre but logical. Bats naturally roost in dark spaces, attics, eaves, warehouses, barns. If bats could be harnessed to carry incendiary devices, released over enemy cities, they would seek shelter in the most flammable parts of the buildings. Then, a delayed fuse would ignite. Fires would start deep inside structures, bypassing defenses, sowing chaos from within. It would be a city set ablaze not by bombers, but by the very architecture itself. The Bat Bomb program, codenamed Project X-Ray, was officially developed by the U.S. military. They selected the Mexican free-tailed bat, a small, plentiful species capable of carrying a payload several times its own weight. Tiny incendiary bombs were designed, small enough to attach to a bat's body, but potent enough to ignite wood, paper, and cloth when triggered. The bats were placed in special canisters, large bombs packed with hundreds of tiny compartments. Each compartment held a single bat, sleeping, sedated. The canister would be dropped from a bomber aircraft at dawn. As it descended, a parachute would deploy, the canister would open, and thousands of bats would scatter, seeking hiding spots. Within minutes, the city would become a maze of hidden fires. Early tests were surprisingly effective and disturbingly destructive. During one trial at a New Mexico military base, bats carrying live incendiaries accidentally escaped. They roosted under a fuel tank and inside officers' barracks. Both buildings burned to the ground. This unintended success convinced project leaders that the bat bomb could work far better than expected. They estimated that using bat bombs against Japanese cities, with their wood and paper construction, could have caused fires even deadlier than those later achieved with conventional firebombing. But the project was slow. It required meticulous research, studying bat behavior, perfecting the incendiary devices, training flight crews. And by 1944, a faster, deadlier weapon had emerged: the atomic bomb. Compared to the instantaneous devastation promised by nuclear fire, the bat bomb seemed outdated before it could be deployed. The project was quietly canceled. Thousands of hours of work, millions of dollars, and one of the strangest ideas in military history were shelved. Still, the bat bomb remains a chilling reminder of a fundamental truth about warfare. Innovation doesn't always follow logic. Sometimes the most devastating ideas come not from brute force, but from looking at nature and asking the wrong questions. Not, how can we destroy the enemy? But, how can the enemy destroy itself? Imagine it. No sirens, no mass bombings, no thunder of incoming planes, just an ordinary morning. Until shadows flutter from the rooftops, until smoke begins to rise from every corner of the city, until panic sets in, not because of an army, but because of creatures no bigger than your hand. Thousands of tiny saboteurs, each one carrying death on its wings. The Bat Bomb Project stands as one of history's strangest experiments, a weaponized intersection between nature and human ingenuity. A vision of war fought not by soldiers, but by instincts, by fear, by things you cannot see until it's far too late. Because in war, the greatest terror isn't always what roars down from the sky. Sometimes, it's what flutters quietly through the cracks in your defenses. Hollow coin explosives, when every touch was a death sentence. Picture it. A Cold War city, gray, damp, buzzing with whispers. Spies blend into the crowd. Papers change hands in alleyways. Every glance carries suspicion. And somewhere, in a crowded cafe or a hotel lobby, a small object passes from one hand to another. A coin. Ordinary. Worn by time. Forgettable. Until it detonates. Not with the force of a battlefield bomb, but with the brutal intimacy of a secret murder. The hollow coin explosive was not built for war in the traditional sense. It was built for war in the shadows. A weapon small enough to fit in your palm, and lethal enough to end a life in an instant. The Cold War was a battlefield without borders. From Berlin to Moscow, Washington to Havana, agents fought not with armies, but with secrets. Every handshake, every conversation, every pass-in glance could be an ambush. And the weapons of this secret war reflected that paranoia. Tiny, silent, untraceable. The hollow coin explosive fit perfectly into that new world. The design was elegantly cruel. A standard coin, usually a large denomination like a silver dollar, was carefully hollowed out. Inside, engineers concealed a small but deadly explosive charge, rigged with a pressure-sensitive or chemical fuse. Handled carelessly, dropped, twisted, examined too closely, the device would detonate. Small blast. Maximum lethality at close range. The perfect tool for assassinations, sabotage, or destroying critical information before it could be captured. Because in the world of spies, the difference between success and failure could be as thin as the metal skin of a coin. Imagine the psychological effect. You're an agent operating behind enemy lines. You're handed a coin, as payment, as a signal, as a token. You pocket it without thought. Later, in a safe house, you empty your pockets onto the table. The coin wobbles. The pressure fuse triggers. And in an instant, the room fills with fire and shrapnel. No gunshots, no witnesses, just a life erased by a sliver of metal. The use of hollow coins wasn't limited to explosives. Throughout the Cold War, intelligence agencies like the CIA, KGB and MI6 used hollow coins to smuggle microfilm, poison capsules, even miniature transmitters. Coins were perfect disguises. Ordinary, plentiful, easily overlooked. A hollow coin in the right hands was a passport to hidden information. In the wrong hands, it was a silent killer. And that ambiguity, that knowledge that any object might be a weapon, bred a constant, gnawing fear among agents on both sides. One famous incident occurred in 1953, when a young American newspaper boy in Brooklyn accidentally dropped a nickel. It split open, revealing a tiny, secret compartment inside. Inside the hollow space was a microfilm message, written in Russian code. The incident led to a major counterintelligence investigation, eventually exposing Soviet spy rings operating inside the United States. Though it wasn't an explosive device, the principle was the same. Coins were not always what they seemed, and trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild. The concept of tiny, concealed explosives evolved over time. During the Cold War, similar designs included hollowed-out pens, cigarette cases, and even eyeglass frames, all capable of hiding deadly surprises. Each device served the same purpose: make the enemy doubt every object, every touch, every seemingly harmless interaction. Because once doubt takes root, paranoia grows. And when paranoia grows, mistakes happen. And in the world of espionage, one mistake is all it takes. Today, hollow coin explosives are more legend than reality. Their use was rare, their deployment highly specialized, but their existence proves a chilling truth about warfare, especially the warfare waged in the shadows. That death doesn't always wear a uniform. It doesn't always march in lines. Sometimes it waits quietly in the things we trust most, in a coin, in a handshake, in the quiet, ticking seconds between suspicion and disaster. The hollow coin explosive wasn't just a tool of death. It was a message, a reminder that in a world built on secrecy, nothing is innocent, nothing is safe. And sometimes the deadliest weapons are the ones you never see coming, until it's far, far too late. Chirping toe poppers, the trap you never saw coming. Imagine a humid jungle in Vietnam. Thick trees, wet earth, buzzing insects. Every step feels uncertain. Every sound could mean danger. You move slowly, carefully. Your weapon is ready. Your eyes scan the trees, the undergrowth, the shadows. And then it happens. Not a bullet, not a shout, just a tiny chirp. And then the ground beneath you explodes. Not enough to kill you immediately, but enough to take your foot, your leg, your hope of walking out of the jungle whole. This was the weapon known as the chirping toe popper, a landmine designed not to kill, but to maim. And its purpose wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The toe popper, officially known as the M14 landmine, was developed by the United States during the Cold War and used extensively during the Vietnam War. It was small, compact, deadly in the quietest way possible. Designed to be hidden easily beneath dirt, leaves, or water, the M14 could lie undetected for months, even years. Its pressure plate was sensitive, requiring just a few pounds of force to detonate. A single step was enough, and the result was catastrophic. The explosion wasn't meant to kill, it was meant to shatter. The blast typically destroyed the victim's foot or lower leg, leaving them alive, conscious, and screaming. In the brutal math of guerrilla warfare, this made sense. A dead soldier could be left behind, but a wounded soldier required help: stretchers, medics, evacuation teams. It tied up manpower, slowed down operations, sapped morale. One chirping toe popper could cripple not just a soldier, but an entire unit. The nickname chirping came from a chilling side effect. Some versions of the mines emitted a faint noise, a high-pitched chirp or buzz when armed. Soldiers who knew the sound would freeze instantly. A single misplaced step could mean mutilation. Even if the mine didn't explode, the mere fear of stepping on one was enough to slow patrols to a crawl. Because every patch of dirt, every fallen leaf could hide disaster. And the mind, once consumed by that fear, begins to betray itself. The Viet Cong, expert in guerrilla tactics, quickly adopted similar designs. They crafted homemade mines using scavenged materials: tin cans, gunpowder, nails, wood. Some were even nastier. They would coat fragments in filth or feces, ensuring that survivors suffered deadly infections even if they lived through the blast. The goal wasn't just victory. It was to break the enemy's spirit, one step at a time. Imagine the effect on soldiers. Every path became a nightmare. Marching was torture. Patrolling was agony. You couldn't trust the ground beneath you. You couldn't even trust your own boots. The sound of a single chirp could send adrenaline flooding through your veins, your muscles locking, your instincts screaming to run, even though running meant stepping blindly into even greater danger. The jungle didn't need to fight you. It just needed to wait. The deployment of toe poppers wasn't random. They were often placed near trails, water sources, supply drops, and helicopter landing zones. Anywhere soldiers had to move. Anywhere they couldn't afford to hesitate. And the placement was often cruelly strategic. A mine here, another 5 steps later, another after that. Even survivors could end up isolated, bleeding out alone, the jungle swallowing their screams. Toe poppers were small, but they reshaped entire battlefields. They forced armies to change tactics, sending engineers forward with metal detectors, probing every inch of ground. They slowed advances, disrupted supply lines, increased casualties far beyond the immediate blasts, and they left psychological scars deeper than any bullet wound. Because once the ground itself becomes the enemy, there's no rest, no safety, no end to the fear. Long after the war ended, the mines remained. Thousands of unexploded toe poppers continued to maim and kill civilians, farmers, children, travelers. For decades, the aftermath of that hidden war echoed in the lives of people who had never carried a rifle, never worn a uniform. Because a war fought with fear doesn't end when the shooting stops. It lingers, under the ground, in the mind, in every cautious step. Today, the chirping toe popper is a grim reminder of a larger truth. That in modern warfare, the battlefield isn't just about who shoots faster. It's about who controls the ground. And sometimes, the most effective weapon isn't the one that kills. It's the one that leaves you alive to remember the cost of every step, every choice, every breath, and every tiny sound that tells you you might not leave the jungle whole. Sonic cannons, when sound became a weapon. You're standing in a city square, a protest, a gathering, tension rising like heat from the pavement. You expect confrontation, maybe riot police, maybe tear gas, but not this. A vehicle pulls up, boxy, unremarkable. Mounted on its roof is something strange, a disc, a horn, an eye that doesn't blink. There's no warning, no explosion, no smoke, just a sound. Not even a sound, a force. It punches you in the chest. It rattles your teeth. It scrambles your thoughts. You cover your ears instinctively, but it's already inside your skull. You can't fight it. You can't run from it. It's everywhere. This is a sonic cannon. a weapon built not to kill, but to control. And it changes the battlefield in ways a bullet never could. Sonic cannons, officially known as long-range acoustic devices, LRADs, were developed in the early 2000s by the U.S. military and private defense contractors. Their original purpose was simple: a non-lethal tool to deter threats, to control crowds, to scatter forces without shedding blood. They work by projecting focused beams of sound at frequencies and volumes high enough to incapacitate. At close range, an LRAD can produce sounds exceeding 150 decibels, louder than a jet engine at takeoff, loud enough to cause pain, loud enough to cause disorientation, loud enough to cause permanent hearing damage, and all without a single bullet being fired. The weaponization of sound isn't new. Ancient armies used war drums, trumpets, horns, not just to signal movements, but to terrify enemies, to drown out orders, to break morale. But the sonic cannon refines that ancient tactic into a modern science of pain. Instead of inspiring fear from a distance, it attacks the body directly. At the right frequencies, sound stops being heard and starts being felt. It vibrates the bones. It disrupts the inner ear. It triggers nausea, vertigo, even temporary blindness. You don't just hear the sonic attack, you live inside it. Imagine standing in a crowd as the sonic cannon activates. You feel it first, a deep, resonant pulse that makes your skin crawl. Then the pain comes. Not sharp, not like a stab. More like your entire body being shaken apart at the seams. You can't think straight. You can't focus. You can't fight. All you can do is retreat or collapse. And that's exactly the point. Sonic weapons are designed not to eliminate threats, but to make them choose to flee, to turn anger into fear, resistance into retreat. The LRAD first saw use in military settings, protecting convoys, deterring pirates off the coast of Somalia. But soon, it found its way into domestic law enforcement. Police departments in the US, Canada, Europe, and beyond began deploying sonic cannons during protests and large gatherings. Officially, they were classified as communication devices, tools to broadcast warnings over long distances. But when warnings turned into deterrence, the real purpose became clear. Sound could be a crowd control weapon, invisible, instantaneous, devastating. Controversy followed. Human rights organizations warned about the potential for permanent hearing loss, brain injuries, and psychological trauma. Protesters described sonic cannon attacks as experiences of helplessness and terror. Lawsuits were filed. Policies were rewritten. But the devices remained, a chilling reminder that in modern conflict, you don't need to break bones to break resistance. You just need to make people unable to stand their ground. The science behind sonic cannons is simple, but terrifying. At certain intensities, sound waves trigger the vestibular system, the part of the brain that controls balance and spatial awareness. Overload it, and you become disoriented. Increase the frequency, and your organs vibrate painfully. Push it even further, and the very act of standing becomes impossible. It's not violence in the traditional sense. It's violence inside the body. A battlefield waged under the skin, behind the eyes, beneath conscious thought. And there is no easy defense. Earplugs and headphones can muffle some sound, but focused sonic beams bypass external protection. Sound is a force that finds you wherever you are. No wall, no armor, no shield can stop it completely. Once the cannon locks on, you are in its grip, and escape is often the only option. Today, sonic weapons are part of the growing arsenal of non-lethal technologies. alongside tasers, rubber bullets, tear gas. But non-lethal does not mean harmless. Because pain changes minds, fear changes decisions. And control, in the end, is the ultimate goal of any weapon. The sonic cannon reminds us of an unsettling truth. In modern conflict, what matters isn't how much force you can unleash. It's how quickly you can make someone decide to stop fighting. And sometimes, all it takes to end a battle is sound. Operation Wandering Soul. When fear was broadcast from beyond the grave. Imagine you're deep in the jungles of Vietnam. Night has fallen. The canopy above blocks the stars. The only sounds are insects, distant water, the thud of your own heart. And then you hear it. Not a gunshot, not a scream. Something worse. A voice. Soft, sorrowful. Calling your name. You don't see anyone. You don't see anything. But the voice weeps in the darkness, pleading, mourning, warning you to turn back. You grip your rifle tighter. Because deep down, you know it's not an enemy you can shoot. This was Operation Wandering Soul, a chilling psychological weapon used during the Vietnam War. A weapon that didn't aim for the body. It aimed for the soul. During the Vietnam War, the United States faced an enemy that was elusive, resilient, and deeply rooted in cultural tradition: the Viet Cong. American forces realized early that conventional warfare would not break them. Firepower, bombs, and bullets were not enough. Victory would require something different, something unseen, something that could haunt. The strategy behind Operation Wandering Soul was based on Vietnamese spiritual beliefs. According to traditional Vietnamese folklore, if a person died far from home, without proper burial rites, their soul would be doomed to wander the earth, lost, tormented, unable to find peace. The spirits of the unburied dead, known as wandering souls, were feared. They were reminders of dishonor, unfinished duty, and eternal suffering. If American forces could tap into that fear, could make the enemy believe they were being haunted, maybe they could weaken morale. Maybe they could even drive them out of hiding. The plan was chillingly creative. Specialists in psychological warfare, known as PSYOP units, created eerie audio recordings, whispered voices, children crying, women mourning the loss of sons, husbands, brothers. The voices spoke in Vietnamese, pleading for the living to abandon the fight, to go home, to avoid becoming lost souls themselves. The recordings were laced with ghostly echoes, strange distortions, and unnatural silences, crafted to sound otherworldly. Imagine lying in a jungle bunker. The night presses in. You think you are safe, hidden. And then, faintly, you hear, "My son, why are you here? Return home before it is too late. I cannot find my way. I am lost." The voice drifts on the wind, impossible to pinpoint. Your comrades hear it too. No one speaks. No one moves. Because in that moment, belief and fear are stronger than training and orders. And the jungle, always indifferent, now feels haunted. The recordings were broadcast through hidden speakers mounted on helicopters, boats, and ground patrols. In some cases, soldiers even placed speakers in the jungle itself, attached to trees or hidden among the roots. The sound would move, drift, and shift, making it impossible to locate or escape. And the effect, while difficult to measure, was powerful. There are reports of Viet Cong fighters abandoning tunnels, deserting outposts, refusing to move at night. Because fighting an army is one thing, fighting the voices of the dead is another. Operation Wandering Soul was never meant to win battles outright. It was a tool of erosion, slow, subtle, unrelenting. It chipped away at morale. It sowed seeds of doubt. It turned the darkness of the jungle into an enemy of its own. And in war, sometimes it's not the bullet that breaks a man. It's the fear that nothing he does can save him. Not every broadcast worked. Some Viet Cong fighters, hardened and deeply ideological, resisted the fear. Others, understanding the tactic, countered it with rituals and chants to protect themselves from spirits. But the very fact that such countermeasures were needed proved that the operation touched something deeper than tactics or training. It touched belief, and belief, once disturbed, is difficult to mend. Today, Operation Wandering Soul remains one of the most fascinating examples of psychological warfare. Not because of the technology, not because of the tactics, but because it recognized something timeless, that in every human heart, no matter how brave, no matter how trained, there are fears older than war itself. Fears of death, fears of isolation, fears of becoming forgotten. And in the stillness of the jungle, when the stars are hidden and the wind carries voices not your own, those fears become real. Sticky bombs, when desperation turned to innovation. It's 1940. Europe is burning. Armies fall like dominoes. Nations crumble under the roar of tanks and artillery. And Britain, battered and isolated, faces a terrifying possibility: invasion. German tanks, hardened by victories across France and Belgium, seem unstoppable. Traditional weapons feel useless. Desperation fills the air like smoke. And desperation, in war, often births strange creations. This time, it created the sticky bomb. A weapon so crude, so dangerous, that it killed as often as it saved. A bomb that didn't just explode. It clung. The official name was the number 74 ST grenade, but soldiers quickly gave it a more fitting title: the sticky bomb. It was designed as an anti-tank weapon, something light enough for infantry to carry, but powerful enough to cripple the steel monsters that had shattered Europe's defenses. The idea was simple: cover a grenade with an adhesive substance, throw it against an enemy tank, have it stick firmly to the armor, detonate. Simple in theory, terrifying in practice. The bomb itself looked strange. A glass sphere about the size of a small melon, filled with a highly volatile explosive compound, usually nitroglycerin. The sphere was coated with a strong adhesive and encased in a thin metal shell to prevent it from sticking to everything during handling. Before use, the soldier would pull off the metal casing, exposing the sticky surface underneath. A simple flick of the safety pin armed the device. After that, there was no going back. You had only a few seconds to attach the bomb to your target, or be blown apart by your own weapon. Imagine the pressure. The battlefield around you is chaos. Smoke, shouts, the rumble of approaching armor. You see the tank. You pull the pin, tear away the casing. The bomb is live, sticky, dangerous to everyone, including you. You sprint toward a machine designed to kill you. You dodge machine gun fire. You close the distance. You slam the bomb onto the tank's hull. And then you pray you can get away before it detonates. Because the sticky bomb didn't just demand courage, it demanded madness. The weapon had serious flaws. The adhesive often struggled to stick to dusty, muddy, or wet surfaces, a common condition in real battlefields. If the bomb fell short or failed to adhere properly, it could stick to the ground, or worse, to the attacker. More than a few soldiers were killed by their own sticky explosives, because once it was armed, there was no safe way to disarm it. No second chance. No forgiveness. British Home Guard units trained extensively with sticky bombs, preparing for the expected German invasion. tactics evolved. Use cover to approach. Aim for vulnerable spots, tank tracks, engine grills. Work in teams to distract and confuse tank crews. But even with training, using the sticky bomb was an act of raw, reckless bravery. Because facing a tank with nothing but a glass globe of nitroglycerin felt less like fighting, and more like gambling with your own soul. Sticky bombs weren't unique to Britain. Across the war, different versions appeared. The Germans developed their own adhesive mines, small charges coated with magnets or glue designed to stick to armor. The Soviets trained dogs to carry explosive packs under enemy tanks, a grim testament to how desperation fueled ingenuity on every side. But the British sticky bomb stands out, not for its effectiveness, but for its symbolism. It represented a time when the line between courage and suicide blurred completely. When nations, cornered and alone, told their citizens, "If you see a tank, you will stop it, or die trying." In practice, sticky bombs achieved limited success. Against lighter vehicles, they could be devastating. Against heavily armored tanks, results varied. But their true impact wasn't measured in destroyed tanks. It was measured in morale, in proving that even the most unstoppable enemy could be faced, could be fought, could be burned, if not broken. Today, sticky bombs are remembered as a relic of another era, an era where war wasn't fought cleanly or rationally. It was fought with glass spheres full of death, with hands sticky from terror and determination, with men who ran toward steel monsters armed with nothing but glue and grit. Because sometimes in war, victory doesn't belong to the strongest army. It belongs to the last man brave enough to hold on tight, even when everything else is falling apart. Gas shells with psychological labels, when fear was more lethal than gas. The trench is quiet. Mud squelches underfoot. Rats scurry in the shadows. You stare over the parapet, waiting for the next barrage. And then it begins. A distant thump. A shriek of shells flying through the mist. You dive for cover. You brace for impact. The shells land, not with explosions, but with hisses. A cloud, low and heavy, begins to roll toward you. You know what it is. Everyone knows. But what kind? Mustard gas? Phosgene? Something worse? You glance at the shattered casing near you, and you see it. A stenciled word. One simple word. Enough to set your blood running cold. Because sometimes the deadliest weapon on the battlefield is not the gas itself. It's the fear of what you think it might be. During World War I, chemical warfare changed the face of battle forever. Gases like chlorine, mustard gas, and phosgene weren't just designed to kill. They were designed to terrorize. And one of the most effective tactics of psychological warfare was surprisingly simple. Mark the gas shells with terrifying labels. Chemical shells were often stenciled with names or codes describing the type of gas they contained. Sometimes it was a technical code. Other times it was a word crafted to inspire panic. Soldiers who saw the label didn't always understand the chemistry. They didn't need to. All they needed was to recognize one thing. This gas could kill me, and there's no time to find out how. Imagine being in the trenches. You hear the shells land. You smell the first acrid bite of chemicals. You see a broken casing labeled with a code you half remember from training. Maybe it says Green Cross. Maybe Yellow Cross. Maybe something worse. Each color meant a different death. Green Cross, phosgene, the silent killer. Yellow Cross, mustard gas, the blistering agent. Some shells were even falsely labeled, designed to sow confusion, delay, hesitation, because hesitation in a gas attack is death. Take too long to don your mask, and it won't matter what kind of gas it is. Your lungs will already be drowning. Training manuals drilled soldiers on what each label meant. But in the chaos of battle, in the roar of artillery, in the blind panic of the first choking breath, knowledge often failed. Fear took over. Gas attacks didn't just kill, they broke discipline. They shattered order. They turned seasoned soldiers into desperate animals, scrambling for masks, for cover, for air. And the simple sight of a coded label was enough to trigger that collapse. The psychological impact was deliberate. Chemical warfare wasn't always efficient at killing en masse, but it didn't have to be. If a single gas shell could empty a trench, break a defensive line, cripple a battalion's will to fight, then it had already won. And the words stenciled on the shell casing were as powerful as the gas inside. By 1918, the use of psychological labeling had evolved even further. Some shells were intentionally mislabeled to trick the enemy, marking high-explosive shells as gas shells, causing defenders to don masks unnecessarily, exhausting themselves, blinding their vision, making them easier targets for conventional attack, or vice versa, sending real gas shells disguised as ordinary explosives, giving soldiers just a few fatal seconds too late to react. In this way, labels became more than warnings. They became weapons in themselves. A war of symbols and trust, fought in the thin margin between life and death. Imagine the battlefield after a gas barrage. Men lying face down in the mud, clutching at their throats. Gas masks torn off in panic. Eyes swollen shut. Skin blistering. And beside them, the empty shells. Cold, silent, stenciled with names that meant everything, or meant nothing. Because by then, it didn't matter whether the label was true. It didn't matter whether the gas was deadly or not. The fear had already done its work. Chemical warfare was banned by international law after World War I. But the psychological lessons it taught remained. Fear is a weapon. Confusion is a weapon. Symbols, even simple painted words, can wound deeper than steel and fire. Because once fear enters the mind, it corrodes everything. Orders, bravery, hope. Today, the old gas shells lie buried deep beneath forgotten fields, rusting, silent. But if you were to find one, brush the dirt from its surface and read the faded letters stenciled there, you would still feel it. That chill down your spine, that ancient, instinctive terror. Because when war turns the very air against you, and the enemy can kill you with a single word, you understand. The deadliest weapons aren't always the ones that explode. Sometimes they're the ones that whisper, and they never stop. Active denial system. When pain became a beam of light. You stand on a road in the desert. The sun is brutal. The ground shimmers with heat. But you're used to that. What you aren't used to is what comes next. Without warning, your skin ignites in agony. Not with flames, not with cuts, but with a heat so intense it feels as if your entire body is being burned from the inside out. You stagger back, you shield your face, you try to flee. And just like that, the pain vanishes. No visible wounds, no blood, no smoke. Only the memory of pain so real, so immediate that it left you helpless. This is the active denial system, a weapon that fires no bullets, no bombs, no shrapnel. Just pure pain. The active denial system, ADS, is a non-lethal directed energy weapon developed by the U.S. military in the early 2000s. It was designed for a simple, unsettling purpose: to stop threats without killing them, or at least to make them stop moving, stop resisting, without leaving lasting physical harm. The ADS does not burn. It does not tear flesh. It does not break bones. Instead, it weaponizes one of the most primal instincts known to life: the desperate, uncontrollable need to escape pain. The science behind it is deceptively simple. The active denial system emits a high-powered beam of millimeter-wave radiation at a frequency of around 95 gigahertz. When the beam strikes human skin, it penetrates less than 0.4 millimeters, just deep enough to interact with the nerve endings. The sensation it produces isn't warmth, it's pain. Intense, immediate, full-body pain. Victims describe it as standing in front of a giant blast furnace, as being set on fire without flames, as every part of the body screaming at once. And it forces a reaction so primal, so immediate, that thought disappears. You don't choose to retreat. You have to. Imagine facing it. No warning shot, no visible weapon. Just a sudden, inescapable feeling that the very air is turning against you. You stumble back, clutching at your skin. And once you leave the beam's focus, the pain is gone. No wounds to treat, no blood to clean, only the memory. And memories in the right hands are weapons too. The active denial system was envisioned for crowd control, perimeter defense, and checkpoint security. Military bases, embassies, critical infrastructure. Situations where lethal force might create political nightmares, where making an enemy flee without killing them became the new tactical goal. After all, a battlefield littered with corpses invites retaliation. But a crowd that disperses, writhing in invisible agony, sends a different message. You are not welcome here, and there is nowhere to hide. Despite its intended purpose, the ADS faced significant controversy. Early testing raised alarms. What about effects on the eyes, the heart, the brain? Could prolonged exposure lead to deeper burns? Could individuals trapped by obstacles suffer lasting injury? The military responded with safety protocols, automatic shutoff systems, limited exposure windows, strict operating procedures. But the underlying truth remained. The active denial system was not built to protect. It was built to hurt. And the moral line between non-lethal deterrence and cruel punishment blurred under the desert sun. The psychological effects of the ADS were profound. Pain is universal. It bypasses culture, language, ideology. It unravels courage in seconds. It dismantles resolve before a word is spoken. A crowd may resist tear gas, may endure rubber bullets, may rally against baton charges. But few can stand against pain delivered at the speed of light. Pain that leaves no scars, only fear. The active denial system was deployed in limited tests in Iraq and Afghanistan. It saw use in riot control scenarios, on military bases, at experimental checkpoints. But its public use remained rare. The optics were complicated. Because while a bullet wound could be justified, a weapon that invisibly cooked the flesh was harder to explain, harder to defend, harder to forget. Today, the ADS still exists, stored away, tested, whispered about in military circles. A reminder that modern warfare isn't always about death. Sometimes it's about control, about dominance, about making survival itself so painful that surrender becomes the only sane option. Standing under an open sky, feeling the ground solid beneath your boots, you might think you're safe. But the active denial system proves a darker truth. The battlefield no longer begins where the enemy stands. It begins inside your own nerves, inside your instincts, inside the ancient, primal terror that tells you to run before you even understand why. The long-range acoustic device, LRAD, when sound became a weapon. You're standing in a crowd. At first, it's just noise, chatter, movement, a low hum of life. Then something changes. The sound thickens, sharpens, becomes a force you can feel in your teeth, your bones, your skin. You cover your ears instinctively, but it doesn't matter. The sound pierces through you. Your stomach twists. Your balance falters. Your thoughts scramble like leaves in a storm. You don't know where the attack is coming from, only that you have to move. Now, this is the long-range acoustic device, the LRAD, a weapon that doesn't fire bullets, doesn't drop bombs, it fires sound. And sound, wielded with precision, can be just as devastating. The long-range acoustic device was developed in the early 2000s by the American technology company LRAD Corporation. Originally intended as a communication tool, it quickly evolved into something much more sinister. A device capable of projecting focused beams of sound over incredible distances, with the power to disorient, incapacitate, or disperse anyone caught in its path. The LRAD wasn't just a loudspeaker, it was a sonic cannon, and it changed how forces handled everything from riots to military engagements. The design of the LRAD is deceptively simple. A large dish-shaped array, mounted on vehicles, ships, helicopters, or tripods, uses advanced acoustic technology to focus sound into a tight, directional beam. The result? Instead of sound spreading outward in all directions, it travels straight, like a lance. At moderate settings, the LRAD can project voice commands clearly over distances of up to 5,000 meters, reaching targets beyond the range of traditional megaphones. At higher settings, it becomes a weapon. One capable of emitting sounds at up to 162 decibels, louder than a jet engine at takeoff, louder than the threshold of immediate physical pain. Imagine standing in the path of that beam. The sound doesn't just fill your ears. It drills into your head. It rattles your chest. It scrambles your balance. The noise becomes everything, pushing rational thought aside, leaving only the raw animal instinct to flee. And that's exactly the point. Because the LRAD was designed not to kill, not even to injure. It was designed to control, to make resistance impossible without ever pulling a trigger. The first real-world use of LRAD came during military operations in Iraq. It quickly expanded to naval engagements, where ships used it to warn off approaching vessels, especially small boats suspected of harboring suicide attackers. The device gained international fame after being used aboard the cruise ship Seabourn Spirit in 2005, successfully fending off a pirate attack off the coast of Somalia. But the LRAD's real controversy began when it was turned inward, when police departments began deploying it against civilians in protests, riots, and large public gatherings. From the G20 summit in Pittsburgh to demonstrations in Ferguson, Missouri, the LRAD became a new symbol of state power, a sound you couldn't see, a pain you couldn't fight. Critics were quick to raise alarms. Exposure to LRAD beams, especially at high intensities, can cause permanent hearing loss, vertigo, tinnitus, and even neurological damage. Lawsuits were filed. Human rights groups protested. But the devices remained, standard issue for many law enforcement and military agencies around the world. Because in a world obsessed with non-lethal solutions, the LRAD offered a tempting promise: control without blood, fear without visible scars. The psychological effects of the LRAD are even more profound than the physical ones. Because once you've felt it, once you've stood helpless in that invisible beam, something changes. You realize that safety isn't about armor or walls. It's about distance. It's about submission. It's about understanding that when sound itself becomes a weapon, no amount of bravery will save you. Only retreat, only surrender, only silence. Today, the LRAD continues to evolve. Smaller models, more portable systems, more sophisticated directional control. Its use is expanding in border control, in disaster zones, in urban management. Wherever crowds gather, wherever authority fears chaos, the LRAD waits. A machine that doesn't kill you, just makes you wish you could disappear. Sound has always been part of warfare. The drums of ancient armies, the trumpets of cavalry charges, the battle cries across bloodied fields. But the LRAD turns sound from inspiration to domination. It turns air into a weapon, pain into command, and silence into the ultimate act of survival. EMP grenades, when the battlefield went dark. You crouch behind cover. Your rifle hums in your hands. Your comms crackle quietly in your ear. You can feel the battle moving toward you. The enemy's drones circle overhead. Radios squawk orders across the lines. Vehicles rumble through the dust. And then, in a blink, everything changes. A small object arcs through the air, no bigger than a fist. It lands with a soft thud, barely noticed. No explosion, no flash, no roar, just silence. Your rifle clicks uselessly. Your comms go dead. The drones spiral out of the sky like broken toys. You're cut off, alone, blind. This is the power of the EMP grenade, a weapon that doesn't destroy bodies. It destroys technology. And on the modern battlefield, that's often deadlier than any bullet. EMP stands for electromagnetic pulse, a sudden, high-intensity burst of electromagnetic energy that can fry electronics in an instant, from radios and sensors to navigation systems and drones. Traditionally, EMPs were associated with nuclear detonations. High-altitude nuclear tests in the 1950s showed that even a single blast could disable power grids hundreds of miles away. But as warfare evolved, scientists and engineers began to imagine something smaller, more precise, more tactical, a way to shut down the enemy's technology without leveling cities. Thus, the concept of the EMP grenade was born. The idea was simple and terrifying. Build a portable device that, when activated, unleashes a localized electromagnetic pulse. Anything electronic caught in the radius would instantly fail. Radios, drones, targeting systems, digital locks, even advanced rifles and optics. In a world increasingly dependent on technology, where every soldier is a walking network node, an EMP weapon becomes a scalpel for modern chaos. One small device, one silent pulse, and an entire squad is reduced to primitive instincts, cut off from command, communication, coordination. The technology behind EMP grenades is complex. Creating a powerful electromagnetic pulse requires generating, storing, and rapidly releasing vast amounts of energy. Most prototypes use a combination of capacitors to store electrical energy, coils or antennas to focus and release the pulse, explosive-driven magnetic flux compression to amplify the effect. The challenge is balancing power with portability. A grenade must be small enough to throw or deploy quickly, yet powerful enough to disrupt enemy systems. Achieving that balance has been the holy grail of military research for decades. Imagine it in action. You're defending a convoy. Enemy forces deploy automated drones, mapping your every move. Your comms are jammed. Your infrared scopes flicker with false readings. You toss a small black cylinder into the open. You crouch, brace. There's no visible blast, only an invisible ripple through the air. The drones fall like dying birds. The enemy's targeting systems glitch and die. Their radios buzz with static and silence. And for a few precious moments, you control the battlefield. Not with superior firepower, not with numbers, with nothing, with absence. EMP grenades bring something terrifying to warfare: the weaponization of emptiness. They don't inflict wounds you can see. They steal sight, steal sound, steal certainty. They reduce modern soldiers, dependent on their gear, to frightened, isolated individuals. And in that moment of confusion, the real attack can begin. Not all EMP grenades are purely theoretical. Some experimental models have been tested by major militaries around the world. Specialized versions exist to protect convoys, disable IEDs, improvised explosive devices, and neutralize enemy surveillance. Others are larger, vehicle-mounted, drone-deployed, designed to sweep entire areas clean of hostile electronics. But the dream remains: a hand-thrown device small enough for any soldier to carry, capable of erasing the enemy's technological advantage in seconds. Imagine what that means for the future. Warfare where bullets are obsolete, where the battlefield is decided by who can blind, deafen, and isolate their enemy first. Where the most powerful weapon is not destruction, but disconnection. And once you're disconnected, alone, without sensors, communication, navigation, you're fighting blind. You're already losing. Today, EMP grenades remain rare, their full potential still locked in labs and black-budget programs. But the direction is clear. As armies lean more heavily on drones, AI, smart weapons, and networked systems, the value of shutting all that down in an instant becomes priceless. Tomorrow's war may not be about who fires the first shot. It may be about who kills the power and leaves the enemy stranded, helpless, in a battlefield they can no longer even see. The EMP grenade reminds us of a simple, chilling truth. In modern war, strength isn't measured by how much you can destroy. The Maxim gun, when war became a machine. The battlefield is still. Men in neat lines, bright uniforms, drums beating a steady march. They carry rifles, bayonets gleaming in the morning sun. They know the old rhythm of battle: fire, advance, reload, fire again. But today, the rhythm changes. Today, death no longer waits between shots. Today, death pulls its own trigger. From behind a low rise, you hear it, a sound no human army has ever heard before. Not a shot, not a volley, a roar. Continuous, relentless, mechanical. Men fall in droves before they even raise their rifles. They don't know it yet, but war has just entered a new age, and its name is the Maxim gun. Invented in 1884 by Hiram Stevens Maxim, the Maxim gun was the world's first true automatic machine gun. It didn't rely on hand cranks like the Gatling gun. It didn't require teams of soldiers to reload after every shot. It fed itself. It reloaded itself. It fired as long as the trigger was pressed and ammunition was available. A single operator could unleash hundreds of rounds per minute, an impossible volume of fire for any group of riflemen. And in doing so, the Maxim gun shattered the traditions of centuries of warfare. The secret was in its brilliant, brutal simplicity. The Maxim gun used the energy of the recoil from each fired bullet to eject the spent cartridge, reload a new round, and cock the weapon for the next shot. It turned every explosion into the power for the next one. For the first time, a single soldier could wield the firepower of an entire company. No reloading under fire. No frantic hammering on trigger mechanisms, just an endless roaring river of bullets. Imagine facing it. You're advancing, shoulder to shoulder, across an open field. You hear the whine of bullets passing you by. The man to your left stumbles. The man to your right crumples. You realize you are not under fire from dozens of rifles. It's one weapon, one unseen machine vomiting death faster than you can think. Your training tells you to advance. Your instincts tell you to flee. Because bravery means nothing against a machine that does not tire, does not hesitate, does not miss. The Maxim gun saw its first major deployments in colonial warfare. In Africa, Asia, and beyond, European powers used it to devastating effect. Against armies equipped with swords, spears, or slow-loading rifles, the Maxim was unstoppable. One British officer, after witnessing the carnage, remarked bitterly, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." In battles like the 1898 Battle of Omdurman, where a small British-Egyptian force faced tens of thousands of Sudanese warriors, the Maxim gun turned what could have been a desperate fight into a one-sided massacre. Thousands died within hours. It wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. But the true horror of the Maxim gun wouldn't be felt until World War I. By then, the Maxim design had been copied, modified, improved. Machine guns lined every trench. They covered every no-man's land. They turned every open advance into a suicide charge. The result was an endless stalemate, an industrial slaughter. Men ordered to march into walls of lead. Officers forced to rethink everything they knew about bravery, tactics, and sacrifice. The Maxim gun didn't just change the battlefield. It ended the old battlefield. And it started something darker. An understanding that in modern war, machines would rule. That courage and heroism would matter less than engineering and logistics. That flesh would always lose against steel. It wasn't just the killing power of the Maxim. It was what it represented. The beginning of the mechanization of death. A world where battles weren't won by men, but by factories, by inventors, by endless streams of ammunition feeding endless hunger. Today, surviving Maxim guns sit in museums, silent, polished, almost noble in their appearance. But they are reminders, chilling ones, that humanity's greatest leaps in technology often come at its darkest hours. Because the Maxim gun taught the world something terrible, that death, once handed to machines, would never be handed back. And once the gears began to turn, the battlefield would never again be a place for men alone. It would belong to the machines, to the roar of endless fire, to the future we could never unmake.